All right, welcome everybody. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome to our Globalization at the Crossroads, nearshoring and reshoring to meet local goals and reduce risk. A conference that it's kind of a follow-up conference to our conference that we had in February that looked at sustainability. And you're going to see that some of the issues related to sustainability, and especially when it comes to manufacturers and suppliers looking down their supply chains to decide what they're going to do for nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, whatever. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. Talk a little bit about Automotive Futures, conference logistics, and the intro for the conference. So as I said, I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute, and you can reach me at my U of M email address. Funding for our group comes from our affiliate program. We could not put these conferences on without them. I like to thank them multiple times throughout the conference, and also look for, as always, looking for new affiliates to join the group. Our research is focusing on globalization, powertrains, and ITS. That is a little broader because it looks at IT in the auto industry overall, and in the vehicles as well as in the companies, and our 5 annual conferences. These are our affiliate members. Again, we'd like to thank them very much for their support. We couldn't do it without them. And when you look at the affiliates themselves, the advantages of being an affiliate is you get early results from research projects before they're released to the public, free attendance for all your people in your companies, in the affiliate companies at our conferences. If AF Automotive Futures researchers deliver a state of the industry presentations to companies, we include our members' questions in our sample of industry, manufacturers, suppliers, government officials. And one of our new things for 2024 is a 20% discount for classes at the U of M Executive Education Program, the Ross School of Business, Digital and Open Enrollment Programs. So this is something new that just started this year. We also have research partners. So for our research projects, we reach out to the IT organizations, the OEMs, government NGOs, suppliers, and consulting companies. If you look at the work that we're doing, our upcoming next conference actually is our propulsion strategies for the 21st century, our 16th annual, and we'll be focusing on the future of charging. Our EV Evolutions group is looking at the policies that are affecting the introduction of EVs in China, the US, and the EU. And also looking at our future of automotive IT. And this year, we're going to be looking at AI in the auto industry. We did this last year as well, but AI is such a new part of the industry that we decided to do it again this year to find out how things are changing, if at all. Also, the coming automotive supply chain and this conference, Globalization at a Crossroads. Those are the 2 conferences that we're focusing on for supply chains, and our 17th annual Inside China conference, which will take place in November. Our researchers are made up primarily of student researchers, but also Kara Alkire is our senior research associate. She's online right now, manning the YouTube video. And if you have questions, she'll be moving those questions over. And also Sherry Nettler's with us today, managing the conference in the room. We encourage everyone to join our LinkedIn page. You receive updates of all our future conferences. We're posting 2 to 3, sometimes 4 times a week. So about research that we're finding out about from our EV Evolutions group, from our conferences, and our research. We'll do pieces of that will go on to our LinkedIn page. We use it as our only form of social media. As I said, our next conference in July is the 16th annual Propulsion Strategies for 21st Century. And we're looking at the future of EV charging. And again, as I said, the AI in the auto industry, part two, and that's not in July, but actually in September. Okay. So we've got 4 speakers today. Jeremy Kay from Boston Consulting Group, Amy Brogland-Peterson from Michigan State University. They're going to be talking more on the business side of the nearshoring, reshoring, and how manufacturers and suppliers, automotive manufacturers and suppliers are dealing with this issue. In the second part of the conference, Sergio Ornelas, who's the editor for Mexico Now, and Justin Hoffman, who's the deputy assistant of the U.S. Trade Representative for Market Access and Industrial Competitiveness, they're going to be talking more from more of a government perspective, country level perspective about nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring. So we're looking forward to their talks. As I said, we're going to start out with Jeremy. We'll do a Q&A, and then the Q&As are available to everybody online. If you have a question, you can enter it into the chat. If you're online here, you have yellow cards on the tables, so feel free to, if you have questions that you want answered, write up those cards, and I will review them and put them up. Ask our presenters. So we'll start out with Jeremy and then Amy, then we'll take a break, then we'll go to Sergio and Justin, again, Q&A after each one of those, and then about 12:45 we'll adjourn and have lunch, at least here in the room. At post-conference, all the attendees get links to the presentations. The video will also be on the website. I sent you the link to the website that has all the information about the bios for the, and I think the next slide will have that. Yeah, the agenda, the bios, registration list, sponsorship opportunities, affiliate information, upcoming events, all that's on the website that we sent to everybody who registered for the conference. And I said audience questions and conference feedback. If you have any things that you think we should be doing differently, both good and all things that we're doing well, please let us know when we send out the link to the presentations, which will be around. They'll be going out this weekend. So let me talk a little bit about as an intro to the globalization at the Crossroads. Now, we've been studying globalization, since probably 2005 was our first study that looked at our Inside China conference, that looked at the Chinese automotive industry at that time. We followed that up with a number of conferences. We've continued to focus on China just because of the growth of the industry, but we also looked at the Brazil and in India and Japan and the looking at those countries as well. But we also, when it comes to globalization today, we're really especially in this particular conference, we're looking at supply chain issues. How are manufacturers making decisions and suppliers are making decisions about whether to nearshore, reshore, friendshore as well. So and as well as onshoring, kind of keeping things that are already in the U.S. Still in the U.S. or and also the reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring. So there's a lot of options that the companies have when they're making changes in their supply chain. And the reasons why are they making changes in their supply chain? Well, basically because of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and also there's some localization rules that are in effect now and we'll talk a little bit about that with the IRA and in particular that are looking at options and ways of bringing more of the supply chain and manufacturing back to the U.S. The current view of globalization, it kind of goes against the golden rule of globalization, which is to buy products with the combination of lowest price, highest quality, and reliable delivery anywhere in the world. And this is something that's very different from what we were when we first started studying globalization at the turn of the century. It goes, but it also goes against the current trends. Really goes against the just-in-time delivery and carrying excess inventories that are key elements of the Toyota production system. So our discussion today is going to be on several topics. And we're talking about, when we talk about supply chain resilience, we're really trying to, the manufacturers and suppliers are really trying to decide how to avoid some of the problems that they faced when they were dealing with the pandemic, the Europeans in particular with the war in Ukraine, and how you're dealing with these supply chain adjustments. And also the force of regulations that are also affecting them. So how much resilience is enough? Will it increase cost and vehicle pricing? How do companies find the right balance of onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring? Looking forward to Jeremy's talk on that. What role will dual or multiple sourcing play in supply chain resilience? How do companies decide what to dual or multiple source? Can companies overlap tracking their complete supply chain for sustainability with resilience? So this is where that point where I was mentioning earlier, where there's a kind of overlap with our previous conference. How can companies actually profit from these processes? Are there ways that are going to make it more profitable for them? And what will differentiate the winning and losing companies in developing resilient supply chains? A little bit of the background, when you look at the global supply chain pressure index from 1998 to 2022, you can see that the pandemic had a dramatic effect, and as well as the war in Ukraine, especially in the EU. Having an effect on global supply chains. And when you look at the differences of monthly exports to the United States from Mexico and China, you see the crossover fairly recently in 2023, where Mexico crosses over and is now, we're getting more monthly exports from Mexico than we do from China. And this is not necessarily automotive, this is overall. When you look at the percentage reduction of offshoring procurement in dollar value, 2023 compared to 2021, you can see there's big bunches of decreases all across the board. Overall for Asia, for US, and for Europe. What are the auto companies doing? What are they planning for their supply chains? Well, in terms of inventory management evolution over the next 3 years, you look at the automotive industry is a little different from some of the other industries that are much more focused on trying to revise inventory management strategies, including decoupling points and buffer sizes. The auto industry is expecting more of that than they've done in the past, but not as much as healthcare, commodities, construction chemicals, and advanced electronics. So that's a very interesting story in terms of where the auto industry is and where they seem to be heading based on a recent survey by McKinsey. When you look at the distribution of procurement locations in terms of dollar value, they're expecting domestic markets to increase. Compared to and also nearshoring increasing and offshoring decreasing, and so there's some significant drops in that they're expecting between since 2021 all the way out to 2025. Again, this is a survey from Capgemini. When you look at where the manufacturers and the suppliers really differ significantly, it has to do with their following strategies to mitigate logistics challenges. Again, this is all part of responding to pandemic and the war in Ukraine. The suppliers much more focused on building inventories, increasing working capital, investment in equipment and fleets, establish longer relations and contracts, workforce, closer collaboration with customers, and securing more capacity. Again, significant differences between manufacturers and automotive. These are autos. These are auto people. Difference between those. And one of the things that they notice that are in the boxes are strategies that require additional working capital or operational investment. And this is where we're going to have this discussion that looks at, what's the cost of doing the things that they're suggesting. And we also look at the percentage of executives adopting short-term strategies to improve resilience. Here, the manufacturers, suppliers are a little more in sync. Monitoring is still a bigger deal in supply base than it is for the manufacturers. Purchasing from open markets, mandating monitoring inventory among suppliers. Pretty evenly distributed there, very similar to the story of sustainability of trying to go down the supply chain. Dedicating working capital to ensure better supply management. Increases there for both manufacturers and suppliers are seeing that as important, and building more inventories for critical components. More supply base than the manufacturers. One could argue that this has probably always been the case, that suppliers have always kept more inventory. You never wanted to be a supplier who closed the plant because of shortage of parts. Even though the Toyota production system would say we're not carrying inventory, and you should not be carrying inventory. It should be all things should be delivered just in time, and everything should be efficient that way. And I think the pandemic really changed some people's minds about how that's been going to play out. And then when you look at the manufacturer-supplier relations, you still have some things that aren't changing. Automotive OEMs overstate production goals. We do not share information with our automotive customers because they could negatively affect our competitive advantage. And automotive OEMs consider their suppliers as equal partners, a little less than 50% there. And also the percentage of suppliers whose risk is being monitored, so that tier 1 is being monitored, tier 2 almost half as much, and tier 3 much less. So it shows you that there's a lot of work to be done. But some things are changing. When you look at especially the semiconductor world, where the manufacturers and suppliers say that they're investing in secure semiconductor supply capacity as an alternative to traditional tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, and also bringing software development traditionally undertaken by tier 1 suppliers in-house. Big deal there in terms of the manufacturers switching how they're doing things. There are other things that are changing, building inventories and allocating more working capital, pivoting to prioritizing high margin, readily available product, semiconductor sourcing. Product strategy now includes generic or readily available semiconductor components, and building redundancy of sources throughout the supply chain. Big difference from the past. It's not less than 50% are saying that this is happening, but it's a big difference from the way things have been done in the past. But some things are changing. The average future supply of battery raw materials secured shows you that even though they don't have, not very many companies have 10 years, but 20% have 5 to 10 years, and 41% have 2 to 3 years of raw materials. This is a big issue for of course, the transition to EVs. What's the government doing? Well, the government is trying a variety of things, for provisions for resilience and reshoring. The Inflation Reduction Act provides tax credits for vehicles usually utilizing battery materials originating in North America. USMCA requires 75% of a vehicle's components must be manufactured in North America. The vehicle is to be exempt from tariffs. And you can see back in 2020, 2021, 2022, the CARES Act, the CHIPS Act, the supply chain reviews that have been done by executive order by the White House, that looking at the 6 industrial-based sectors, trying to look at one-year supply chain assessments. So these things are things that the government has been doing. They also have been trying to engage with international partners. They've done quadrilateral security dialogue, and Justin Hoffman is going to be talking probably a lot about this. The U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, U.S.-Mexico high-level security dialogues. But there are some diplomatic challenges that they're seeing. Lack of accessible data about private sector supply chains, and most current U.S. trade agreements were not designed to build resiliency or address supply chain disruptions. I'm curious to see how Justin thinks, is thinking about that, and as they're making plans for reviewing USMCA in 2026. But they have been engagement and coordination with their U.S. partners. Using the Federal Register to send out requests for information, mapping exercises between Secretary of State and Commerce have worked together, partners, and international as well as local. Early alert system to gather information voluntarily provided by semiconductor manufacturers, and interagency and private sector input. And how are the supply chains adjusting globally? Well, I just have two case studies. One is from Central and Eastern Europe. And here you have, they were and this is from Prague University, they were really struck hard by the war in Ukraine. So based on what they had done during the pandemic, it wasn't as big of an adjustment for them. They improved their communication and exchange of information within companies. Again, these are automotive companies. They're able to react and reach appropriate people because of similar simulation situations they had in COVID during the pandemic, and they were able to hear back faster. They switched to alternative transportation modes and routes. They continued a strategy of increasing stocks of critical components. And then I like the critical component story, because this is one of the topics I want to talk about today is, which components are so critical that they need to be dual sourced or multiple source. They transformed production processes due to lack of spare parts during the war. New measures for production and transformations didn't have to be developed, as the appropriate and relevant ones that had already been designed during the pandemic. So in some ways, you can see that the Europeans are a little ahead in terms of being able to, because of their adjustments during the pandemic, on how they dealt with the Ukraine war. And in Sweden, Polestar did a supply chain resiliency practices to address their disruptions during the pandemic and Ukraine. This is from the University of Gothenburg that collected the data. And one of the big changes that following the pandemic is that Volvo Cars now does their own purchasing of components directly from suppliers' factories through their own carriers. It gives them better control of the whole transport process. When the war began, Volvo applied the lessons that they had learned during the supply chain disruptions in the pandemic, and their supply chain was able to use a contingency plan to move production of wire harnesses in Ukraine out there, avoiding the issue of significant reduced production. And due to shortage of semiconductors after the pandemic, Volvo now has a specially tailored team that focuses on semiconductors. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about for today with our speakers through our Q&As and in our discussion with the speakers and with the questions that we get from our audience. So let me stop my share and bring in Jeremy Kay from Boston Consulting Group. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Let me do an intro for you. Jeremy Kay leads the Boston Consulting Group's operations practice in the Great Lakes area and co-leads the operational resilience work globally. He has more than 2 decades of hands-on operations experience, specializing in supply chain procurement and cost excellence topics. Jeremy has particular expertise in direct materials procurement within industrial goods. He primarily serves manufacturing clients across several industries, focusing on industrial goods and automotive. But before consulting, Jeremy held positions as purchasing manager at Navistar, commodity manager at TRW, commodity manager at Federal Mogul. He's a certified professional in supply management and member of the Institute of Supply Management. Welcome, Jeremy.
Bruce, it's really great to be here, and I'm super excited to be speaking with you all today. I assume you can hear and see me okay?
Yep, you're looking good, and we hear fine.
Great. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about because it's something that I got exposed to quite a bit earlier in my career. So this was when I was at Navistar and I was managing their commodities buying group. So we managed all of the commodities that we purchased, both directly and indirectly through the supply chain. And a lot of that role was about risk management in terms of prices of commodities. And it was probably around 2010 timeframe that I was looking for ways to expand the impact that we could make. And I had a thought, because we had recently experienced a couple of high-profile supplier bankruptcies, caused a lot of disruption to our supply chain, that could be a natural extension of what my group did, which was, well, maybe we should have a program to better manage our risk within our supply chain. And so it was right about that time that I got started with building that capability at Navistar, that the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened. And so that really put us through our paces. And I remember we built up a whole war room. We mapped out all of our suppliers. And we tried to estimate what the potential impact of this nuclear disaster was going to be on our supply chain and where we needed to act. But what quickly became apparent is that we were only getting one piece of the puzzle, which was we only knew what was going on with our first tier suppliers. Those were the only ones that we really knew the location of, that we're able to map out. And we didn't see a lot of exposure with our first tier suppliers, but we were still really concerned about what were the other impacts further down in supply chain. And that experience taught me, I think, my first fundamental lesson about supply chain resilience. And it's one of the reasons why I've continued to be interested in this topic. I've continued to research this topic since I've been in consulting, served clients on this topic, is that it's not an easy one to solve. And it really starts with having really good understanding of your supply chain, and not just your direct supply chain, but your supply chain multiple tiers down. So today, I'll talk a bit about BCG's view and my own view on supply chain resilience and what makes for a resilient supply chain. And I'll also talk a little bit about one of the levers within building a resilient supply chain, which is around the structure of your supply chain. And so in particular, nearshoring, reshoring, dual sourcing. We have some really cool data from a recent BCG study that looks at landed costs across multiple different companies, or multiple different countries supplying into the US. So I'll go through a bit of that as well, which I think will be a good parlay into some of the other presentations that you have coming up later today. So to get started here, quick summary, and none of this is probably a surprise, but it's been pretty tumultuous over the past few years in the automotive supply chain. And the incidents that we've experienced aren't just isolated incidents. What I'm seeing is a pattern of a sustained high level of risk and increased disruptions in our supply chains. And I think that there's a couple of factors behind that. One is the impact of climate change and having more and more severe weather events that are impacting supply chains. And two is the geopolitical climate that we're in that's quite strained with, a war in Ukraine and trade tensions amongst different countries, particularly the US and China, as well as the push towards sustainability is causing some increased changes to the demand profiles out there. And so these things I think are going to continue. And so auto companies really need to have a robust ability to understand their supply chain, to monitor and sense risk, the right processes to respond, and they need to have a program to structurally improve the resiliency of their supply chain so that they're able to avoid or absorb risks more easily. As I mentioned, and as you all know, there's been a lot of disruptions over the past few years, and these are likely to continue in one way or another. Even if they don't continue at such a rapid and frequent pace, supply chain disruptions in the future are still going to cause problems for manufacturing companies. In particular, within automotive, the disruptions of the past few years have revealed kind of 5 primary challenges. The first one being a relatively weak starting point. And some of this is just legacy around what Bruce was talking about with the Toyota production system and just-in-time delivery and lean inventories, and also, a big push towards globalization to reduce cost. There's second is a lack of visibility and end-to-end ownership, particularly for tier 2 suppliers and beyond. Like my example from the Fukushima disaster, we didn't even know where we were buying from on a tier 2, and certainly not a tier 3 basis. And you saw this in the whole semiconductor supply chain crisis. It wasn't the tier 1s that were a problem. It wasn't even the tier 2s that were a problem. It was much deeper in the supply chain where the big bottlenecks and capacity constraints were. And that's part of the reason why this took people by surprise, because it wasn't their direct suppliers. It was a lot less predictable. Third, companies lack the right capabilities, including technology, to be able to identify when there's a potential risk or an issue. They don't have the right early warning signs in place. And then fourth, when they do see that there's a problem, they're slow to react. So they don't have the team, they don't have the processes, they don't have the operating model in place that's going to allow them to very quickly respond in a crisis. And then finally, and it's kind of linked to the first point of a weak starting point, just the structural weaknesses in automotive supply chains. A lot of single points of failure, a lot of sole sourcing of components because that's the most cost-effective way to do it. It's always been a big emphasis on cost and driving down cost year over year, which gets things leaner and it gets things riskier. And at some point, you reach a tipping point where any kind of disruption is going to push you over the edge. We also see that from a macro level, CEOs are concerned about this, and they're still concerned about it. So this chart shows a synthesis of keywords from quarterly earning calls for something like 4,000 to 5,000 companies every quarter. And you do a keyword search and you see what are the most prevalent issues that CEOs are talking about. And you see that supply chains or supply chain resilience or risk is one of the top issues out of 7 of the last 8 quarters. And it's been the top issue for 3 out of the last 8 quarters, the most frequently cited theme or issue or keyword in those earnings calls. So it's still top of mind, even though we're pretty far away from the immediate effects of COVID now, and it feels like things are more stable. This is still a chief concern for a lot of senior executives. And the reason why is because it has a huge impact. Now, without saying anything in particular about whether these companies had resilient supply chains or not, we can look at some comparisons of earnings over the period immediately after COVID. And what we saw is that there are some companies in the automotive sector who significantly outperformed and were able to supply to the market. And maybe you take Tesla out because it's a little bit of a different picture. But when you look at like BMW and look at Toyota, they were able to supply to the market when some of their competitors couldn't. And they were able to leverage that to significantly increase their profitability during that time period. And conversely, there were other OEMs, including GM, Ford, VW, that struggled more in terms of their supply chain challenges, particularly around chips, that resulted in profitability and earnings and volume decline during this period. So we know that if you can respond better in a crisis, or if you're better protected, that you're going to perform better. And that holds true across a macro view. And as we think about what does resilience really mean, it means two things. One is your supply chain has inherent resilience. It's better insulated. It can better absorb potential shocks. And it also means that you recover more quickly. And all of these are points of comparison. It's all relative. It's all relative to your competition. And so companies that are more resilient are able to turn disruptions into a source of competitive advantage, to not just gain all of this space in between the two lines here, which is value that gets created during a disruption and the subsequent recovery, but they're actually able to sustain some of that competitive advantage and some of that market share growth and profitability increase beyond the full recovery, whereas non-resilient companies, when they have a disruption, end up permanently losing market share or losing profitability. And so in this way, companies that are able to unlock this can significantly outperform competition and can turn any kind of disruption, be it a little disruption or day-to-day variation, variability, volatility in their supply chains, or even mega events, into a way to grow their market share and to differentiate. If we look, though, at what companies are actually good at doing this, so BCG partnered with APQC, I don't know, I think it was about a year and a half ago now, to conduct a capability survey around resilience. And I think a lot of folks know like what some of the main levers are, like dual sourcing to improve resilience. They know you need better visibility to improve resilience. But nobody really knew how good they were relative to others. And is that good enough? And so what we saw, if we look at along two dimensions, how quickly you can recover, which includes your visibility into your supply chain, and also how well insulated you are, your ability to absorb potential disruptions. And we plotted companies' capabilities out along these dimensions. What we found is only about 10% of companies had the right set of capabilities to be prepared for the next disruption. And about 80% were lacking on both dimensions, an ability to recover and absorb. So then you might be asking, well, okay, so what do we need to do about this? And here's a little bit of a complicated framework, but this really embodies how I think about how BCG thinks about supply chain resilience and how these pieces all fit together. So if we start at the center of the circle, to develop your resilience strategy, you first need visibility into your supply chain. And like I mentioned, multiple tiers down. And you need the ability to assess your supply chain and understand the risks that you might be exposed to within your supply chain to help you prioritize what to go after. And that assessment is not just about the risk, but it's also an assessment of your own capabilities. And then the specific levers that you pull or specific capabilities you develop are split into two pieces. The recover piece at the top. So these are capabilities around real-time monitoring and sensing, knowing about a risk as soon as it happens or even before it happens, so that you can get that first mover advantage to respond really quickly in the face of a disruption, faster than your competitors. Scenario modeling, the ability to understand when something impacts you, how is it likely to impact you? How significant is it going to be? When is it going to end? And to do what if scenario modeling, modeling different kinds of black swan events, for example. And then finally, a series of capabilities, including the right teams and the right processes and the right tools to mobilize very quickly in a crisis, so that you can take advantage of the information asymmetry and what you know that your competitors don't know yet. And then along the bottom are longer term levers about how do you restructure your supply chain and related functions in order to build in more natural immunity to potential disruptions. So first is around network design. This is just where are you relative to your customers throughout multiple tiers in your supply chain. So this includes everything that we're going to talk about nearshoring and reshoring, and basically just shortening your supply chain. So you're removing vulnerability, you're removing lead time, you're removing risk. Second is around your sourcing strategy. And so this is about dual sourcing, multi-sourcing, how you're contracting, partnering with suppliers to guarantee capacity and to make sure that you're going to be covered. Third is around inventory and planning. So I found it really interesting to see that the relative importance of some of these factors between OEMs and suppliers that Bruce shared. And inventory plays a key role in this. And if OEMs don't want to hold the inventory, somebody has to in order to help insulate and provide a buffer in the supply chain. But you don't only want to rely on inventory, because that's often the most costly way to improve resilience. I mean, it's easy, it's straightforward, assuming you can get the materials. You can just stockpile them. And if something happens, you have a stockpile to rely upon. But probably better to pull some of these other levers first where they make sense. And then finally, flexible products and engineering. So this is about having a process to very quickly make and approve design changes, to put in place substitutes and things like that when there's a potential disruption. But it's also just about, from the beginning, designing your products with some flexibility in mind. Instead of having the supplier's name on the print with the supplier's part number and only being able to source to them, working with engineering to open up some of those specifications that will allow for more flexibility in the event that something happens. And then, of course, there's a whole series of important enablers along the right-hand side. You know, as we think about the culture in a lot of companies, when I was in procurement in the automotive industry, you know, more than a decade ago, everything was about cost and everything was about unit price, and it was about how low can we get this and how lean can we get our supply chains. And we need to make these decisions. We need to focus on short-term value. How quickly can we realize these cost reductions? And so there's like this ingrained culture within companies, particularly in the automotive industry, that are just narrowly focused around short-term cost, short-term profitability. And there's a lot to overcome there. And in order to overcome that, you need really good and clear change management. You need great processes and operating model. You need these things embedded, this concept of resilience embedded in your structure, so that it's something that is able to influence decisions. You know, when I was speaking with a major US OEM, I don't know, this was maybe 6 months ago, they had put in place this great like visibility monitoring system. Their supply chain group was really focused on resilience. But what they told me is it hasn't been working because nobody's willing to make different decisions or to make decisions differently than they used to be in the past. And so that's part of the importance of this, is you need to build in this culture of risk management resilience, and you need to embed this within all of the processes, systems, tools, capabilities, decision-making forums that you have. So there's 5 specific things that we can zero in on, particularly for the automotive industry, as we've worked with suppliers and OEMs on this topic over the past couple of years. First of all is around understanding the trade-offs within your supply chain. So there often are trade-offs when you think about resilience. Now, sometimes those trade-offs are better than others. If you think about back to this framework, there's a lot of ways for, let's take a part, that you can make that part or the supply chain for that part more resilient. It could be reshoring is the right lever. It could be dual sourcing gets you what you need. It could be holding more inventory is the most cost-effective way. So understanding what those trade-offs are, what the cost of risk and resilience are within your supply chain, and being able to build that into your decision-making processes. Second is around integrated business planning, sales and operations planning, sales and operations execution, whatever you want to call it. But it's having an integrated planning capability that allows for the right decision-making forums to actually make those trade-offs. Increased transparency and collaboration with suppliers and customers. This is like the underlying theme that I've been talking about the whole time, is if you better know what's going on, and if you can better collaborate with folks. And I'm talking about true collaboration. I'm not just talking about you as the customer demanding that your suppliers share information. Sometimes it needs to start with you sharing information and you opening up some of your, not really your cost books, but your supply chain books, and sharing things about your own inventory situation, your own demand forecast, and providing that transparency to your suppliers, and then asking for some transparency in return. There's also a digital component to this. Any of the levers that we looked at on that framework can be enhanced with some sort of digital capability. And what we're finding a lot of interest in and a lot of value from are next generation planning tools that not only allow you to just better manage supply and demand within your supply chain, but tools that have integrations with risk sensing and the ability to map out a multiple tier supply chain, all integrated together, that allows easy access to information, and not just knowing that you have the information, but the ability to synthesize it and to leverage AI and things like that to help you proactively identify where your greatest exposures are. And then finally, crisis response planning, cross-functional decision making. So I've got like a page behind for each of these, but I won't go through them because I hit the highlights. You'll see it in the deck that will be sent out afterwards. But I did want to touch on real quick a couple of things around global manufacturing costs before we open it up to questions. This is a study that BCG did late last year, where we looked at the relative cost of manufacturing in many, many countries around the world. And we looked at it on a total landed cost basis imported into the US. And we didn't just look at like what's some price benchmark, but we really looked at true factor costs in each of these countries. How expensive are raw materials relative to other places in those countries? What's the labor cost, but also what's the labor productivity? Not every labor hour is equal everywhere around the world. Some countries have higher labor productivity than others, maybe because of more automation. What are the costs of energy, natural resources, but also transportation? And then finally, tariffs. And what we found was pretty interesting. And this is a bit of an eye chart. But if you think about goods imported into the US, and if you set the cost of local US production at 100 as far as the index, what's the relative cost of manufacturing and importing those same goods into the US from different countries around the world? Not surprisingly, what we see is Western Europe is very expensive. Even places in the Middle East, the Mediterranean are kind of expensive, but you start to get on a landed cost basis something that's similarly on par with the US. Where we're seeing a lot of advantage, and this should come as no surprise, is Mexico. So not only is it 84% of the cost of the US on a landed basis, but it's also very close compared with Europe and certainly compared with Asia. The other thing that we're seeing is that even without the trade penalty, trade war tariffs, China is no longer significantly less expensive than the US on a landed cost basis. And then you add the trade war penalties to that, and you're looking at 20% higher cost to continue to import, on average, things from China. Where we're seeing some really great pockets of future opportunity are in other smaller countries in Southeast Asia, in particular, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. These are all potential sweet spots for moving goods that you previously bought from China to one of these other countries in Southeast Asia. And it needs to be thoughtful on a commodity by commodity basis. And then also same thing with India. India continues to be an inexpensive, relatively speaking, hotspot. And then I've got a couple pages with some more details, particularly an example around like final assembly costs for automotive, and a little bit of a smaller graph that shows, final assembly costs. So with that, I wanted to open it up to questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Jeremy, you really touched on a lot of the big issues that we're talking about today. And I really liked your approach, because you really gave us a way of saying, okay, these are the things that could be done. But there's issues definitely related to cost, right? When you look at this issue of actually transforming companies, how long do you see this really taking for the companies? Now, you've got a lot of experience with companies now, so you kind of understand where they're at right now. So, and there are probably some companies that are better at this than others, and you've seen that. It was always funny to see that Toyota was able to continue on building, considering that they didn't have any inventory. We always thought that, oh, they're going to go down first. Well, somebody had inventory in that. So you have an understanding of kind of where they're at, right? How long do you think it's going to take them to actually make this transition?
So, I mean, it's probably a journey that never quite ends. There's always going to be new things and ways to improve, and we all have a continuous improvement mindset. But if a company is looking to do like a really focused, transformative effort to do like a one-time build of some capabilities and start the journey of transforming their supply chain, usually what I would think about is the core focus of that program would be something like 6 months, and that would help you build up the digital capabilities, map your supply chain, put in place the right operating model, processes, that kind of stuff, and allow you to understand the risks in your supply chain and to prioritize what risks you want to go after. So that's like to set 6 months to set like the foundation of the program. And then after that, you start just ticking off things going down that list. Like there was a client that I helped last year do exactly this, where we helped them understand and prioritize every single component in their supply chain. What is the potential impact of a failure of those components on overall company profitability? So it wasn't just looking at the cost of those components, but it was looking at the broader impact of a failure in one of those components. And what risk factors were they exposed to? Were they single source? Were they sourced in Asia? Was it a proprietary design? And there were some other some other things like that. We're able to create like this prioritized list that then over time they would set goals to reduce that risk profile going forward. And then, as they would introduce new parts and have new programs, that they would try to create those to be more resilient from the outset.
Very good. Amy, do you have anything you want to add? I don't want to step all over your presentation because you're going to be talking about similar things. So feel free to demur for the moment.
Well, no, there's actually quite a few excellent points made during the last presentation. And in fact, just in the response just now, I'll be covering some very similar things as you mentioned. So yes, I'll just defer so I don't take up too much time before we turn over to me.
Okay, sounds good. Jeremy, when you were talking about next generation planning tools. What are some examples of that?
Yeah, so there's kind of like two broad sets of tools. There's like some specific startup kind of tools that are very focused around supply chain risk and resilience. And so those are tools like ResiLink and Interos and risk methods. And, there's a handful of others that promise like AI algorithms to help you map out your extended supply chain in a pretty quick way. And in my experience, those tools help you get a good starting point, but they're not always super accurate with what your extended supply chain looks like. But it gives you a picture to start from, and then you can start, validating that information, getting actual information into the system, and it gives you some of that proactive monitoring and warning in order to deal with disruptions. Then there's also more traditional players. So these are like Blue Yonder and Kinaxis and systems like that are more traditional around demand planning, supply planning, just like full supply chain orchestration. And a lot of those tools now, I think all of them have implemented better risk and resilience kind of modules within those capabilities that take advantage of the existing networks and connections that you already have with your suppliers through those tools with, inventory visibility and better synchronization of supply chains with your suppliers. And then they layer on some of those risk sensing and monitoring type of tools into those planning suites.
Very good. Thank you. You wanted to, Justin or Amy, if you have anything you wanted to add, feel free to jump in.
I think you covered it well.
One of the issues one of the questions that came up from our audience had to do with the introduction of EVs, and it has to do with based on the cost breakdown of importing components into the U.S. Is any of that analysis based on critical minerals and battery components needed specifically for EVs?
Yeah, so we have kind of a big database behind that analysis of the relative entry factor costs and can look at for specific types of components. Honestly, I don't know if we've done that specifically for EVs. But I think the bigger question for those type of things is less about what's the relative cost in different countries, but it's where can you secure supply and availability. I would say like looking at the cost is more about when you're importing from China today, you need to change that. What countries should you look at going from for something that is relatively available? But for those things that are really core and critical, where there's like this global outlook of a supply demand imbalance over time, that's probably not your first priority. Your first priority is where can you just lock up that supply?
Mm-hmm. Justin, when you look at these issues from a trade perspective, how do you see that differing or changing based on trade issues?
Well, I think with trade issues, we're looking at overall broad policies. It's not necessarily where is the supply, but also, where does the supply, is it in a country that has, a stable governmental regime? Is it a country that has high labor standards or high environmental standards? And so, we shape our trade policies around trying to encourage working with partners and allies such as those that have those high standards.
Very good. Thank you. Jeremy, how can automotive companies utilize AI to improve supply chain resilience? Are there any risk to depending on AI?
There's always risks with reducing some humans in the loop. Like if you don't implement it in the right way, if you don't understand what AI can and can't do. But I would say in general, it's a positive impact to supply chains. Some of the areas where I've seen benefit is around this whole risk sensing, monitoring, visibility angle. There's so much data that's coming at us. We should have all been able to predict the semiconductor crisis. Like the data were available, but nobody had synthesized it or synthesized it and had a loud enough voice to get people's attention. And so where AI can really help is around synthesizing massive amounts of data and helping surface to the forefront those things that have the greatest likelihood to have a significant impact. So we see this a lot in these risk sensing and monitoring type of tools.
Very good. Thank you. Let's see. We had a question here about, and we've talked a little bit about in terms of cost. How about profitability? How do you see the changes that companies have to make? How do you see it affecting their profitability? Obviously, it varies in terms of competitors, but inside their own companies. Company profits, and in the end, vehicle pricing. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like I mentioned, there's always going to be some trade-offs. Occasionally you'll find a sweet spot where you are able to both reduce costs and increase resilience and everybody's happy. But, a lot of those opportunities have already been taken. So like at this point, we are talking about things that may impact short-term profitability, short-term pricing for products in exchange for better long-term stability. And in exchange for having that competitive advantage when there is some kind of disruption. Because when I talk to clients who fared better during the pandemic, maybe because they had more inventory or better supplier relationships or more nearshoring, what they say is that they can now command a price premium for their products because they're known as the people who are reliable and who actually can carry these. So it's not just about the cost angle of building a resilient supply chain, but it's about the benefits to overall company profitability, short-term and more importantly, long-term. And that's the hard part to get folks to think about, to get out of this quarter by quarter, we've got to meet our earnings kind of mindset to building something that's more sustainable for the long term.
Yeah, very good. Last question. Has the automotive industry really learned their lesson, or will they revert back to old ways?
Now, I would say it's a little bit of a mix. I think that companies are better than they were. They have more visibility today than they used to. They're thinking about risk and resilience more than they did 5 years ago, for sure. Are they all the way there? No, definitely not. And the longer you go without a significant impact or disruption, the more likely it is that you start backsliding into some of these old ways as companies chase short-term cost or short-term profitability. So there is a risk. And it's at times like this when we've gotten a bit more stable, that companies shouldn't take their foot off the gas. In fact, now is when they have more time and more resources to make fixes to their supply chain. When you have a disruption, it's too late to dual source something. Like, you just need to make do with whatever you can.
Yeah.
You need to be proactive, and you can only be proactive when you have the time and resources available. And so now is that time.
Very good. Yeah, and I want to talk a little more about the EV story in terms of here you're starting with sometimes very new, completely new supply chains. So you have ability to actually start from scratch on a lot of these components. Let's save that discussion after Amy's talk. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And Amy, let me give you an intro here.
Sure.
So Amy Brogman-Peterson works as a full-time faculty within Michigan State University's #1 ranked supply chain management program, teaching logistics, transportation management, and capstone courses within the undergraduate, graduate, and MBA programs. As an entrepreneur, Amy partners with clients across the manufacturing, automotive, EV, startup, packaging, and tech industries, in addition to the federal government, to confront end-to-end supply chain challenges. Amy previously worked as a supply chain executive within many global companies, including Dana Corporation, Ford Motor Company, American Axle, Robert Bosch, Palpanina, and CEVA Logistics. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. I will go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. So thank you again for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to spend some time with you this morning talking about one of my most favorite subjects. Jeremy did a wonderful job. We have quite a bit of overlap, however, slightly different content. So happy to walk through that quickly, and really want to end up, kind of in the same position where we're discussing the current events, the challenges facing us today, which is certainly seemingly more and more risk-filled as time moves on. So look forward to walking through this briefly with you. So first of all, when it comes to sourcing, I think it's worthy to cover a quick synopsis of why everyone is talking about this. So of course, we're all aware of world events over the past couple of years. But it's important to understand the relevance of China from a global trade perspective, right? So China over the years, and you can find a lot of good graphics that cover the different type of economic indicators, but has risen in prosperity and in trade up to the #1 leading economy for global share of trade export volume at roughly 15% of all global trade today. So the US lags is second at 8%, and Germany, and you can see the list here moving down. So the prevalence is high. And you can also see here that from a GDP per capita perspective, while the US still reigns supreme by most measures, China is gaining very quickly in a very close second, with Germany coming in at third. And that does vary depending on who's putting the data together between some of the different sources listed there. So China's increasing in relevance globally, but we all understand that comes with some risk, as Jeremy also pointed out, not just in China, of course, but from a global perspective as well. So it's increasing in relevance. It's also increasing in risk. So if you take a brief look here at the upper right graphic, you can see that the average workforce age by country in 2021, looking specifically at China, is 38.3 years in comparison to the US of 42.3 years. So first of all, why is that relevant? Because the population in China is aging. An aging population, amongst other things, indicates higher overall pay base. but also a decreasing supply of fresh workers to fill the jobs that are being left behind as individuals retire and move out of the labor force. So while the US is still actually slightly higher in workforce average than China, you can see that there's a number of emergent markets where that trend is actually significantly lower. So starting on the far left, you can see Brazil, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, all hovering at 30 and below typically, which indicates a robust emergent market for employment, which is of course very important. So as we look at cost, and one of the reasons we went to China to begin with is the abundance of labor at low labor rates, which still largely remains the case. However, due to policies over many years and various other factors, there have been a decreasing number of population in China, especially over a number of years, that's leading us to a higher workforce age on average. Additionally, if you look at the labor force participation rate on the lower left, you can see that steadily over the last 15 years or so, the labor participation rate has decreased pretty drastically. So that means out of all available employees in the workforce, those age 16 and over who are able to work, we're seeing a rate hovering around 66%, whereas in the US it's around 62.7%. But that rate continues to fall. Last year, the youth unemployment rate reportedly hit 21.3% in June, at which point China actually stopped reporting that metric. In comparison, the youth unemployment rate at the same time frame last year was around 8.7%. And the unemployment rates overall, as recent as last month, were about 5.2% in China, but around 3.8% in the US. So there's some increasing risk factors from a labor perspective that also are very significant and come to play, and certainly will drive the cost and the availability of the market in China to exist as it currently has. We also have to, of course, look at the regulatory scrutiny, and this could pair up with the geopolitical aspect that we've seen over recent years, right? Looking at the cotton production, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, the CHIPS Act, other geopolitical tensions where we've seen, restrictions on trade to and from of certain components related to semiconductors and chips. The unfortunate part about all of these things is that what has emerged is a very disturbing trend where geopolitical tensions are threatening global trade of critical components for really truly life-sustaining goods, as well as defense mechanisms, critical technologies for communications and other factors. So the geopolitical situation is tightening. It's becoming more of a concern, I think, to all parties involved. And the unfortunate part, when it comes to some of this is kind of the tit for tat mechanism, right? So in an example here that I've been looking at and studying closely and working with the government on, regarding China's cotton production, especially in the Xinjiang region, it is a significant source of cotton for many of the global retailers in the fashion and garment industry. And, as those companies have been exposed for utilizing forced labor or allegations of forced labor in that region, they've stood up in many factions to that allegation. They've tried to make demands that forced labor be ended. They've tried to instill some transparency within their supply chains. And as a result of that, they actually, in many cases, have been wiped from the map from a demographic perspective in China, which in other words means their access to the large base of consumers in China, which is a very important market for all companies globally, really, that have any kind of presence in that market today, has been essentially cut off. H&M being one of the most prominent instances of this behavior. And so H&M was, after speaking against the boycott the production in the region and the forced labor in the region, the Chinese government removed H&M from websites. Retail stores were forced to close. There was a huge online backlash amongst the domestic population, and this led to, of course, a huge loss in revenue for H&M in one of their most important global markets. So while there is increased regulatory scrutiny, we also can't deny the fact that many global companies also have a huge consumer base in China and the greater region of China. And thus they, have to really work and balance around this piece as well. So on a globalization aspect, then it begs the question, have we gone too far? Of course, working in supply chain, we've seen many issues. So, of course, the COVID pandemic started kind of the snowball effect. But during that time, we saw the Suez Canal closure. We've seen Red Sea attacks. We've seen, more recently, bridge infrastructural incidents. And we've seen congestion, all around the globe in response to some of these events, but also in response to greater macro trends, as Jeremy pointed out. So different factory closures, what I call the supply chain of supply chains, also lending a hand. So things like warehousing space, pallets, containers, chassis to haul containers, storage facility capacity, all of that has been tightened. And because of that, the global costs of supply chain and logistics has exceeded expectations and exceeded budgets and forecasts by far. You can see one indicator, just to demonstrate this, and of course there's many more, but the ocean timeliness indicator published by Flexport most recently is showing a average transit time on some of the world's most important and high volume trade lanes, which would be the Far East westbound, which is trade between Asia and Europe, as well as the Trans-Pacific eastbound between Asia Pacific and our west coast of the United States. You can see transit times are hovering right around 70 to 80 days, coming down from a peak of over 120 days at the height of the congestion during the pandemic. Well, for us in automotive, but also in any area, electronics, retail, high fashion, what this translates to is an extension of your cash reserves being tied up in inventory. So inventory carrying factors directly into this metric and how long goods are taking to move from port to port and door to door as they move around the world. And so, if you look way back pre-2020, pre-COVID days, typically you would see around 40 to 50 days in a transit time on one of those two major trade lanes, whereas today it's still hovering closer to 70 or 80 days. So that is a significant amount of cash that is being tied up and holding inventory sheerly, as it transports, especially as we see more diversions around Africa in response to the Red Sea and other tensions in the Middle East. So what does all this mean? Again, that building resilience is critical. And I don't think that that's easily stepped away from. So companies have to confront this. And that's kind of where we move into, well, how do we do that? What is the right sourcing strategy? And there's so many things you could talk about here, right? But first of all, you have to understand where your risk lies. And, while I'm sure everyone here understands risk, it's important sometimes to step back and question, do we really understand risk? Do we really have plans in place to identify various sources of risk within our supply chain, but also to do something about it, right? And so risk obviously can be defined in a supply chain fashion as the process of taking strategic steps to identify the issues in your supply chain. But as Jeremy also pointed out, first, you have to really actually understand your supply chain. From my experience in the corporate world, but also still consulting today, I am never cease to be amazed at the amount of companies, even very large global companies, who still are running a very opaque supply chain. In other words, they may have direct visibility to their tier ones, maybe to their tier twos, but beyond that, it's more and more opaque and limited as to the level of transparency. That's a big problem because many companies have risk embedded deep within their supply chain. And we just saw an instance of this with Volkswagen having a very small supplier providing some type of component that was embedded in an assembly that actually was in violation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. And just recently, Volkswagen ended up having thousands of cars detained while they disclosed this to the US government and figured out what to do as Ro-Ros were inbound full of Volkswagen import vehicles. And so not understanding your full supply chain, not being sure that you're in compliance with the various rules and litigation points that are both existing, but are also emergent. And some of these newer pieces of legislation is very, very critical. And so understanding and taking that very first step is huge. And then one of the things I like to use, it's definitely not my model. This is invented and coined this term pestle from a gentleman out of Harvard back in the 60s, who actually wrote a very intriguing book looking at the business environment landscape, even as early as 1967 when that book was published. But he utilized the PEST model at first and later added the LE to create the pestle model. And this is a really, for especially anyone who is new or, not fully equipped or, utilizing full resources to look at risk. This is a model that can help identify various sources. So, looking at the political, the economic, the social responsibility, the technology piece, the legal piece, and of course, the environment. All of these things factor in, but yet some of them may not be at the forefront. Increasingly, supply chain individuals are responsible for understanding risk, identifying risk, and building contingency plans and mitigation plans to contain that risk. And it's very, very difficult, especially if you do not have full transparency into your supply chain. But this is one way you can look at it and try to identify the various sources. We're also seeing some of the diversification trends in sourcing become more and more prevalent. As both Jeremy and Bruce so eloquently spoke already, we've seen a lot of drive and push for reshoring. It's generally interpreted as bringing manufacturing back to a home country. But in our case, we're talking about the USA. So there's a lot of movement behind this, a lot of excitement about reshoring, and that would be one trend we could be looking at. Nearshoring would be transferring that production to countries in similar time zones, but also closer to markets, right? So in this faction, we'd be talking about Canada and Mexico primarily, although as I'll talk about in a slide or two, there are a number of other countries that are also potential candidates for nearshoring activity in the United States and supporting our manufacturing base, especially in automotive. And then finally, friendshoring. What exactly is that? That's relocating supply chains to countries where risk, especially related to geopolitical issues, is relatively low. So this would be looking at our allies and taking a step to move there. Finally, localization. Buying where you sell and selling where you buy, in other words. So let's talk about these a little bit more. And how they lead into what I call sure shoring. So sure shoring to me is ensuring business continuity through strategic placement of material suppliers and production locations through one or more of these sourcing methods. So sure shoring is a somewhat silly word that a couple of industry colleagues and I came up with back in 2021. We've loosely tossed it around since then. I've seen it used in a couple of other places now as well. But what exactly does that mean? That translates to a risk mitigation strategy through diversification in your sourcing footprint. So moving not necessarily everything from China, but taking another look using the tools, digital twins, network modeling, the other things that Jeremy also mentioned, and building up a design to support where your consumer base is, where your various markets are, and how you can best secure and ensure continuity of supply to those various markets. So that would look a little bit potentially like this. Friendshoring, one of the things that may not be very popular to discuss, but when you talk about nearshoring or reshoring, there's a lot of people interested in bringing jobs back to the U.S., bringing things back to the U.S. And there was certainly a lot of that patriotism during COVID when we saw shortages of key everything, right? PPE, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, food supply, baby formula, you name it, right? Even toilet paper. So the initiative and drive to bring everything back to the U.S., I would say, is not a very well balanced strategy. It's actually quite risky. While I love to see, more activity, more labor, more jobs, the basic issue with that is that we too might have some kind of regional epidemic or other issues that emerge over time. And because we cannot predict everything which might occur, we need to have some type of partnership in place with a regional strategy built up with allies and friends around the world, such that we can jointly protect both the critical infrastructure like ports, like different pieces of a global logistics network, but also that we can supply one another, especially in times of regional disaster, right? So if we had, an abundance of semiconductor supply relocate to the U.S. and we had some, huge devastating event here, we'd be no better off, right? And the same thing if that were to happen in Europe or any other part of the world. So a more balanced and blended approach, I really think is a much more resilient way to attack this, and that would be in friendshoring and building up those things with global allies. Of course, then nearshoring is also relevant and is happening, as we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation here. So one of the great things about nearshoring is, some of those risk factors are mitigated. It's arguable, what the cost portfolio would look like on a pure nearshoring strategy. But definitely some of those transport costs, as well as the affiliated costs, things like inventory carrying costs, will certainly be reduced when you have a more regionalized footprint. So that is an important thing to remember. And then this interesting strategy of localization. So going back to the Uyghur cotton production and some of the, difficulties in pulling out of key markets like China, again, is that huge consumer base there. So in an effort to counter that, there has been some evidence and discussion of companies actually localizing. So instead of pulling out, perhaps taking more of a rooted approach in building for local customers at a local level. And you could extrapolate that back upstream to sourcing for local production at a local level. Does this increase complexity? Sure, but it also does, as Jeremy mentioned, mitigate some of those risk factors when it comes to regional downtime and unplanned catastrophic issues. So if you're producing, for instance, in China, to sell mainly to the China market, and you're also sourced heavily in China, if there are, factory closures or some type of outbreak or weather event, your market will be impacted, your production will be impacted at a local level, but you will not be stuck in the water at a global level. Additionally, depending on how you structure and what capacity exists in your network, you may also be able to subsidize local supply with other plans and factories within your network. So localization is an interesting strategy. There's not a ton of data right now to support activity in this area, but I do think that many companies are at least thinking about it based on the experience that I've had. So finally, are we reshoring? Is it a hot topic? Is it a real trend? I'm sure many of you saw just last month. Actually, it was February, so time's gone quickly. 2 months ago, it was announced that the Mexican import volume had surpassed the Chinese import volume to the US for the first time in more than 20 years. And arguably, that may be a trend that is not looking to reverse anytime soon. So while they're still hovering fairly close to one another, there are many other indicators through the reshoring initiative, labor and Census Bureau data, other economic indicators that are suggesting that we are seeing a lot of heat in activity moving into Mexico. New factory construction, all kinds of other indicators are on the rise, which I think is a very exciting time. I've spent a lot of time in Mexico myself, especially in the auto industry early in my career. And it's a great partnership that we have. I've spent a lot of time along the border as well in the maquiladora structure, which for anyone who's not familiar is a huge piece of our free trade flow and a huge source of value for especially the American OEMs and suppliers that are sending goods down and bringing them back up for vehicle assembly. So we're seeing this. How we get there, though, well, first of all, and Jeremy mentioned this very eloquently, we have to look at some of these trade-offs for the short term and the long term. It might not be cheap to develop a new sourcing strategy. Additionally, you have to take a total landed cost approach, which means you have to be looking at these separate trade-off factors in the supply chain. If you're minimizing inventory, your transportation cost might go up. If you're building more warehouses, your inventory carrying could go up. There is a lot of cost factors that interplay on one another, and today are traditionally objectified and targeted via functional silos with the hopes and desires of arriving at a lowest total cost. What really needs to be looked at, though, is a total cost from a purchasing model perspective as a system, and how we can achieve that. So some of those data factors that Jeremy mentioned are really relevant here. How do we have visibility to the various factors that would build a model such as this? And how do we put those into one model within a company that we can utilize to build and grow from? Too often as well, buyers are often looking solely at the purchase price. And this is a big mistake, but it is a cultural issue as well within many, many companies. And frankly, unfortunately, I don't see this going away too quickly. But the problem is to mitigate this risk, to really move into a more strategic network design, we have to at some point roll down these strategic objectives into the tactical level. In other words, buyers and others in the supply chain functions need to be tasked with and measured on objectives other than piece price reduction, spend savings, other factors related to that. And setting metrics that can help objectify and look at the big picture, and what the risk mitigation might look like as well. So last slide here, getting going. We talked about the total cost of ownership, some of the other tools and consideration factors, looking at network design, looking at your overall footprint. Where are your suppliers? Where are your customers? How are you moving and getting to and from those very important pieces today? And is your supply chain truly optimized? One big thing that is really, really critical, I hear a lot of companies talking about digitization and AI and all these wonderful tools that are coming out for our use. The problem is many, many companies today do not have solid master data. Especially when it comes to their supply chain activities. Some of this is related to many years of outsourcing, things like transportation and logistics and warehousing. And there's other factors involved, even maybe just, a lack of solid processes to capture that data at inception. But it's very, very important if you want to move into the realm of digital twins and, other interesting and great technologies like AI and automation. You've got to have your infrastructure from an information and data perspective very solid. So that's a side note as we cover the network design and digital twin piece here. And then some of the other factors. And then, of course, the last one there, we touched on a little earlier, but duties and tariffs and all the different factors related to trade management. Companies often do not have a solid base of expertise in this area. So it is very critical that companies understand what they're producing, the duties and tariffs which may apply to it, which can be very convoluted and difficult to decipher at times. Other drawbacks and things that might help mitigate some of that exposure. And then ultimately factoring that into their footprint and modeling for strategic upgrading. So with that said, that is all I have. And I would welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. Amy, I really liked you had some really good points here. The localization story is a very interesting one. I think that's really it's another piece of the puzzle of doing the sourcing. I like the idea of you're staying local, but when we look at what's going to happen probably over the next 5 to 10 years in how we see supply chains changing. What are the opportunities within, and I'll just focus on the US here. Amy, what do you see as the opportunities for localization within the US?
Well, certainly it's limited, depending on the industry and the product and the goods.
Oh, definitely automotive.
Yeah.
Only automotive.
So, we have some interesting things that have come into play over the past 6-8 months with regard to our unions and contracts and things like that. And the most recent news coming out of Tennessee just a couple of days ago. So there's some factors that might make the localization picture look a little peaked right now. I think, though, that there's a very solid base here that has existed for a long time of expertise, as well as infrastructure. And one of the exciting things about, where we're at with the technology in the world is the level of automation. So I think that there's a huge opportunity to localize with a blended mix of automation where appropriate and feasible, alongside the talent that we have already in the country from a manufacturing based perspective. So some of those things, are already being done in various factories, smart factory integration. We've for many years had MHE, material handling equipment, automated in various settings, but we're now seeing more advanced automation capabilities, which will really open up the door, I think, for, at least an expanded infrastructure. Blending the best of labor, but in an attempt to mitigate the cost of some of that labor, utilizing the different automation tools that are out there today. So, from a actual geographical perspective, I think there's a lot to gain. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of growth still in the Southeast and the Deep South with regard to automotive. I don't see that going away anytime soon with or without increased union presence. But I think there's definitely a way to enhance that even more so, and bring some of that supply back to the U.S. through the use of automation and other tools as such.
Thank you. Jeremy, how do you feel about the localization story?
Well, I do think that there's a place for localization back into the US, including US manufacturing. If you go back and you look at the manufacturing cost competitiveness index that I showed, the US is at 100, which is actually lower than a lot of other places in the world for your total landed cost. And then you've got to factor in all of those other things that don't kind of go into landed costs, like the less tangible risks and then working capital impact and things like that. So I do think that it is an opportunity, but you sort of need to make the choices on a case by case basis, like where you're seeing the best blend of lower risk, reasonable cost, access to the right technology and the right people and resources as well, which we know in the U.S. has been a struggle the last few years, although labor availability has gotten a bit better.
Oh, we lost you for a second there, Jeremy.
Sorry about that.
No. Oh, yeah, you're back.
Okay. Where did I leave off?
When you're talking about things that are happening just recently.
Oh, I think I was saying, I think that was the end where I was basically talking about labor availability in the U.S. Has been a challenge over the last couple of years. It is getting better, but we're also seeing that availability of skilled labor in other countries, including Mexico, is constrained at times as well. And so you need to take a really balanced approach when thinking about your localization strategy.
Okay. Justin, how do you feel? You guys probably feel pretty strongly about localization.
Yeah, I mean, my job is to, implement the president's trade policy agenda, which is going to be focused on supporting American workers, farmers, ranchers, and so forth. And so, we would, want to encourage more production in the United States and to implement policies that help facilitate that. But we're also, recognize the need to import components or to export. And we want to, also support our company's ability to export into new markets. So localization, broadly is definitely, in the sense that it supports American workers is a goal of the United States. We're always going to support, American workers.
Very good. Thank you. Sergio, I don't know if you had a chance, did you hear all of Amy's presentation and when she was talking about the localization story? I guess this might be a good time to even, kind of move over to the nearshoring story. And here this is really what we're talking about when we're looking at Mexico, Canada. And I'm noticing Amy had, and I think maybe Jeremy had charts that went down to Central America and South America. Sergio, when you look at the nearshoring potentials for Mexico, well, I don't want to step all over your presentation because you're probably going to be talking about some of this stuff. But how do you see that happening over the next probably 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's certainly a movement that will continue in the midterm, for sure. I just wanted to thank Amy and Jeremy for the nice data that serves as introduction to my presentation, which will validate some of the comments. And I also wanted to mention that about localization, we used to call it regionalization a couple of decades back, with the movement of the Japanese and the Koreans and the Europeans into the US. So they are all intermittently terms that, this movement of deglobalization will continue, I think, for the next 5 to 10 years, for sure.
Sergio, one of the questions that came up online, is kind of focused on you, but others can jump in on this. How will Mexican manufacturing be impacted by China investments in the country? What are the risks for USMCA and the US-Mexico relationship?
Well, there's plenty of discussion in that subject, and I will cover that a little bit more extensively, but the Chinese are indeed coming to Mexico. Their intent is not a pure nearshoring. I think they have a hidden agenda for getting into the US market as well. So it's a little combination over there. And of course, there are cultural shocks that Chinese have with the Mexican way of doing business. So, we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Very good. Justin, is there something you can talk about in relation to that topic?
I think it's something that we are monitoring closely. As Sergio has hinted, are these investments geared towards becoming part of the North American supply chain, or are they geared towards becoming a way into the United States, or perhaps a way to circumvent tariff actions? And so, we're monitoring it closely, and then we'll continue to do so.
So and this is a question that I'll start with you, Amy, on this one. Each company has a global supply chain. It's a mixture of onshoring, reshoring, localization, as you said, and friendshoring. And when you look to the future, and we were talking about not right now, but 5 to 10 years from now, how do you see that playing out?
Well,
and only in automotive. Again, only.
Sure. So picking up operations is not an easy thing, right? And I think a lot of companies will maybe not even necessarily go that far. But if they do, and if they are considering that, the thoughts may have started during the pandemic. They're probably, and I'm aware of at least 2 companies right now of their strategic plans where they are in various stages of final approval to break ground on new facilities and, allocate capital as part of their budget and things like that. So they're moving, but they haven't moved yet. And it's a slow process, and so for companies, especially that might not be established like in Mexico or South America or Middle America or anywhere really, it's a tough process because you also, if you're really going to do some of those things, if you're going to nearshore or reshore, you have to find supply. And it does increase complexity. You might not have all the data points. You might not want to pick up and move from certain pieces of your key supply network. So, there's a lot that goes into this. It's not as easy as just saying, oh, we have a problem in China, we're going to pick up and move. This is easily a 5 to 10 year process, right? And so I do think that as part of a overall mitigation strategy, I don't think a lot of companies are going to exit China, but I think they'll diversify, and I think we're starting to see that. The indicators are just showing the beginning of what I think, again, might not be a mass exodus, but it will be a migration. And it may not all end up as, reshoring or nearshoring to Mexico and Canada, like we talked about. I do think there's huge opportunity in certain countries in Asia to diversify, as well as India and, some of our South American friends as well. So I think in 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a different footprint than what we have today in automotive. And I think that will be supported, while it might come with higher complexity and cost, by a more streamlined and risk-prone supply chain. And some of the burden of complexity and higher cost in the form of labor could be mitigated by lower transportation costs, lower carrying costs, and less risk throughout the global supply chain that exists today.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Jeremy has to leave us at 11. You get Jeremy on this topic. 5 to 10 years from now, what do you think what do you see the supply chain, automotive global supply chain in terms of the nearshoring, friendshoring story?
Well, there's a lot that can happen in 5 to 10 years, particularly trade policy, which can, immediately affect things, as we've seen. I think you will, though, start seeing a lot more local production in the region, in maybe North, Central America, potentially even South America. And I think you'll also see a lot more coming out of smaller countries in Southeast Asia. The question is, what's Africa's role going to be in 10 years? And, that's possibly the next emerging market. Although, difficult for them to build all of the right capabilities to serve the automotive industry. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think we're gonna cut it off right now, and then we'll continue our discussion after break. Let's come back at about I think looks like we've got it scheduled for 11:15. So let's take a break, and then we'll come back then and have Sergio and Justin tell their stories. So thank you very much, Jeremy. Take care. Amy, we'll see you back with us, and Justin and Sergio. All right.
Thanks, everyone. It's been great to participate, and open invitation for anybody. If you want to continue the discussion, feel free to reach out to me, and you'll get my contact info will be in the PowerPoint that'll be sent out afterwards too.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to start our second part of our conference with Sergio Ornelas from Mexico Now. Sergio, let me give you a quick intro. As Sergio has over 45 years of experience in international trade and direct investment in Mexico. He was including establishing over 100 industrial projects in Mexico. Sergio is marketing manager at Nord Export and Exporter Consortium, marketing manager at Interceramic, a large tile manufacturer, Director General of Chihuahua State Economic Development Agency, CEO of Intermex Industrial Parks and CEO of and editor of Mexico Now. He has business degrees from Babson College, Southern Methodist University, and Harvard Business School. Sergio, you didn't mention the University of Michigan. The summer of love.
That was a wild summer when drinking age was only 18.
Well, welcome, Sergio. I'm going to have you. I'm going to have you share your slides so you can talk to us about your presentation.
Okay, very good, Bruce, and thank you for having me, and good morning to everybody. And I'll be talking a little bit about globalization in Mexico. So let me start by explaining a little bit about what's going on in the industry in Mexico, and talking about exclusively light vehicles. Okay, so let's review Mexico's position in the global light vehicle industry. So Mexico right now is the #7 global producer of light vehicles. We are within about 150,000 units before catching Germany, and about 250,000 units before catching Korea. So that will probably happen within the next 3 to 5 years. We are also the #5 light vehicle exporter, and the #4 auto parts exporter. And all of this is, of course, thank you to the United States marketplace. In Mexico, the industry employs over 1 million people, is the #1 manufacturer employer, just besides the food industry. And we have over $70 billion of foreign direct investment during the last 13 to 14 years. The big wave of investments came during 2014, 2021, but we've been averaging about $5 billion every year in light vehicle investments. And the industry is about 3.7% of the gross domestic product in Mexico. So it's a very important industry, and it's the one that is running the economy right now. Some of the performance indicators that we have for 2023 is that production was at 3.78 million units, and that was 14% higher than what we had in 2022. Exports are 3.3 million units, up 15% since last year. And of course, all of this goes to the US market. About 80% of the exports go to the US market, where Mexico has a 17% market share of new vehicle sales in the US. So out of 100 vehicles sold in the US, Mexico supplies 17 of them. And this is up 5% since 2022, when the market share of Mexico was 16%. The domestic market in Mexico, well, it's a lot smaller than the US, but we had sales of 1.36 million units, up 24% since 2022. The highest number we ever had was in 2016, when Mexico consumers bought 1.6 million units. And it's pretty healthy, so it's growing quite a lot. Out of those vehicles, hybrids and electrics are only about 5.4%. And that's up 44% since 2022. The most popular vehicle is the unplugged hybrid, which accounts for about 85% of sales. And then the plug-ins hybrids, maybe they are about 8%, and the fully electrics are only about 5%. And out of those sales, China suppliers had a share of 9.7%. So out of 1.36 million vehicles, they have about 140,000 units, which are up 38% since 2022. And they do have a little, well, they have a lot of problems. This is a new wave in Mexico of the China brands being sold, but there are problems with service, with replacement parts, and so forth. This, it's a, let me see if the arrow works in here. This is a chart which focuses on real estate supplied by C.B. Richard Ellis. And let me just move here a little bit. Of course, the spaghetti lines are what Amy and Jeremy already said, that Mexico's exports to the US have overtaken China's. But the blue bars are square meters of construction of new Chinese facilities in Mexico. So take a look, for example, here at this big one. In Q2, in the second quarter of 2022, Chinese built almost 300,000 square meters of factories, which is about a little bit over 3 million square foot of factories. This is only in 3 months. And if you put an average factory of 50,000 square feet, 3 million square feet means 50,000 square feet factories in just 3 months. So this was the high end. On the last quarter that we have in record, it's Q3 of 2023, but they were up to 200,000 square meters times 10.7, which is the equivalent in square feet. So they are still at a level of 2 million square feet of factories being built in 3 months, new ones by Chinese. And where are they going? The balloons over here, there are 3 balloons. One is for 2021. The black one is for 2022. And the light blue is for the first half of 2023. And this is where Chinese factories are being located. So the big winner over here is Monterrey, which had the lion's share in 2022. They had a little decline here recently. Another big place, of course, is Saltillo, which is near Monterrey, and it has a lot of OEMs. And of course, Juarez over here with 25% recently. So the Chinese are concentrated on the north central, northeastern part of Mexico. And according to this research, the demand is about 43% from China for all offshoring or nearshoring projects, 22% from the US, and so forth. And of course, the biggest industry in nearshoring in Mexico is the motor vehicles and parts, followed by electronics and machine tools. So what's happening in nearshoring in Mexico? Nearshoring, of course, is the biggest business and foreign direct investment opportunity that Mexico has ever had. And this is the result of some tailwinds. Interestingly enough, Mexico's winning end comes as the result of external problems, of the pandemic, of the lots in the logistics, in the problems in deliveries and everything else. So global supply problems ended up benefiting Mexico. And then, of course, we've always had the location. And of course, we've enjoyed the free trade agreement with the US, which is now the USMCA, the substitute of NAFTA. And as you saw in the previous presentations, Mexico continues to be the low-cost North American manufacturing platform. I recall that on and around the year 2000, when we had the offshoring exodus of facilities from Mexico and the US to China. At that time, in 2000, the Chinese labor cost per hour was about 50 cents, and Mexico was about $1. Well, nowadays, China's hourly rate is $9, and Mexico's is $3. So we continue to be the low-cost option here for North America. And of course, in terms of the auto industry, we have a very mature labor force, and we have a great engineering pool. Engineers in Mexico cost about a third of what they do in the US. So that's another big cost advantage. But we also have our problems. We have a few things of headwinds. We have how can I put it, not very derogatory, we have a dysfunctional president whose rhetoric creates uncertainty. I mean, he talks about having Mexico be self-sufficient in energy. He talks about not accepting renewables. He talks about a lot of negative things against business. And fortunately, we have elections coming up in June, and we are hoping for the best for changes. Right now, the biggest problem with nearshoring and the establishment of more factories in Mexico is the lack of electric power. As I was saying, Mexico's president just put under the rug millions of dollars, billions of dollars of foreign projects in electric power, especially renewables. And if that wouldn't have been done, Mexico's electric potential right now would be about 20% higher than what we have. So this is a problem that persists. Even though we've had a real estate boom in industrial and logistics buildings, many projects are delayed or canceled because of the lack of electricity, as simple as that. And everybody knows about Mexico's problem with insecurity and corruption, and now immigration. So all of these things come into play as well. There's also, besides electric power, there's saturation of resources, including labor, water, and some infrastructure. Over here, in terms of labor, if you look at the immigration problem, it's actually helping because many of the immigrants that stay in Mexico are joining the labor force. So that's a little relief from that end. But we graduate over 60,000 engineers per year, and then we have a demographic advantage, as they were showing there in the graphs in the previous presentation, and lots of young people coming into the labor force as well. And then the government continues to put regulations, a lot of bureaucracy, and this is a cost for business, because just to keep up with the reports and everything else, it's a administrative burden that companies have to deal with. And of course, the biggest nearshoring project in Mexico is the Tesla factory, which was announced last year, and it would be located in Monterrey, nearby Monterrey, in a huge piece of land. And this would be Tesla's number 5 gigafactory, after all the ones they have in the States and in Asia. The initial investment over here was mentioned at $1 billion and possibly growing to 5. They also announced that job 1 would be on the second quarter of next year, and that we will have initial employment of about 6,000 people. But as you all know, recent developments, all of this is right now up in the air, even though there are many Tesla suppliers already in the area. I believe there are about 30 of them. This project is probably going to be delayed at least for 2 to 3 years, depending on how Tesla is doing. And I just wanted to throw in, Bruce, a little commercial here, that we are organizing the Mexico's Nearshoring Auto Industry Summit coming up in June 13 and 14 in San Luis Potosí, where we have a chance to visit the BMW group plant, which will soon start building electric vehicles. We have a host of speakers, which include this guy, which is the Chinese BYD, Build Your Dreams. And they are the ones that are very aggressively establishing a market presence in Mexico. And we, of course, have other well-known speakers from J.D. Power, BMW, Guido from Standard & Poor's Global Mobility, and other people. And so far, we have about 150 companies registered. We usually get to 500 companies registered, and it's a very good event in Mexico. It's probably the biggest event for light vehicles. And I invite everybody to visit if you have a chance.
Sergio, when you look at the Chinese entrance into Mexico, obviously it's a big deal, and it's happened in the recent past and continues to grow. And are they using the program? And I'm forgetting the introductory program. The shelter organizations. Are they using the shelter program? I guess you should probably explain it a little bit. And
yeah,
then,
well, yes. There are 2 stages to the Chinese coming to Mexico. One is in the manufacturing area, and the other one is in retailing of vehicles. In the retailing of vehicles, they are being very aggressive. We have identified so far 20 brands of light vehicles being sold in Mexico currently, and 10 brands of heavy vehicles. Okay, so as you know, the capacity in China, they are only utilizing like 60% of capacity in manufacturing. So they are aggressively trying to open in other markets. And Mexico, of course, is a big candidate. if you import the unit from China into Mexico, the duty is 10%, as opposed to, I believe, 27.5% in the US. In Mexico, it's 10%, but you have to pay a sales tax of 16%. So it's fairly pretty much the same. But they are coming with very aggressive pricing, fairly good quality, a lot of entertainment options in the vehicles. So they are capturing a good part of the market. Then on the manufacturing side, they are coming just straight in. I mean, Mexico welcomes any foreign direct investment. And the shelter program is something that we offer in Mexico that allows manufacturers to get a quick start and not have a legal presence in Mexico. They just bring in their equipment, a manager, and they take care of production. And what we do, and one of my companies is a shelter operator, what we do all of the daily chores, the accounting, the payroll, the hiring and everything at the direction of the customer, who doesn't have a legal presence, as I said, for at least 5 years. And yeah, indeed, Bruce, I would say that not less than half of the Chinese projects are coming under a shelter program.
About half of them?
About half.
Okay. Yeah, it's a unique situation, a unique program that I learned about just by working with you over the years. That it really makes onboarding a whole plant can be onboarded to very quickly compared to doing everything yourself.
Yes, we actually have what is called speculative buildings, ready to be occupied, and a company can start operations as soon as they can bring in their equipment in 30, even 60 days. And with the nearshoring wave, what is happening in real estate, all of the inventory of manufacturing buildings was gone, I mean, in a year and a half. Right now, developers are coming back to build more facilities, but they continue to come. They continue to move in. A lot of announcements, a lot of good wishes, but again, many of those projects are stalled because of the lack of electricity, and they are slowed down. And so there are problems to the nearshoring in Mexico as well, but it's moving. It's moving.
One of our questions from our audience was, what's your estimate of added Chinese OEM capacity in the next 5 years?
Well, I can speak a little bit for Build Your Dreams brand, BYD, which is the one that is talking about a factory in Mexico the most. And they are saying that they plan to capture a good share of the Mexican market, plus a good share of the South and Central American markets. That they have, they continue to say that they don't intend by any means to reach the US market. They continue to say that. But eventually, of course, we know that, they are paving the way to do that. They have firm plans to build a facility. They are talking to the states. They are selecting central or south central Mexico, which is, they explained that they want to be near the big market in Mexico City. So places like Querétaro, San Luis Potosí, and even Durango have a very good chance of landing the first Chinese production facility.
Very good, thank you. Another question comes from the audience. Where do Chinese companies source their components from? Because if they import components from China, the logistics costs should be increased. But if they do local sourcing, how can they be cost competitive in Mexico?
Yeah, well, of course, right now they are bringing complete units, and for the manufacturing, all of those projects that I explained in the graphs, all of those millions of square feet being built,
Yeah.
they are mostly, about half of them are automotive parts. So their strategy is to build the supply chain of their own slowly. And then I would say that their ideal would be to eventually qualify for the rules of origin within the USMCA in Mexico, which is what Justin is closely monitoring. And I would say that's their ultimate goal, to qualify in rules of origin with the 75% of region content to be able to export to Canada and the US without duties.
Justin, do you see this as something that will be part of the review in 2026?
I mean, it's something that we're monitoring now. And I think it very well could be part of the review in 2026 and definitely part of the conversation between now and then.
Yeah. Amy, do you have any questions for Sergio or any comments you want to add?
My kind of two-pronged question, and you already touched on some of these things, the environmental influence versus China. So how does Mexico stack up from an investment perspective when it comes to land acquisition, permitting, financial incentives, things like that provided by the government or private industry, in comparison to China? In other words, how does a business case for Mexico stack up from a numerics perspective to China, if you have any detail on that?
Well, as you know, I can make a comment on that. As you know, in China, if you buy a regular combustion vehicle, you have to pay the equivalent of about $12,000 for the plates. And if you buy an electric one, the plates are for free. In Mexico, we don't expect to have any of those incentives. The government actually has a budget problem right now, and they don't want to incentivize, especially this president. He likes carbon, he likes combustion. And so we don't see an advantage from the government in terms of subsidies for electric cars. But they are so cheap right now, even without the incentive, that they are moving, especially those unplugged hybrids. In terms of environmental, the biggest problem we have in the industry for light vehicles is actually the used cars imports from the US, okay, which navigate along the loopholes of complying with the environmental regulations. So that's probably the biggest threat in terms of the environment in Mexico. And then I don't know if I touched on all your questions, subjects.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Now, Sergio, when you think of the Chinese suppliers that are coming to Mexico, do you see them coming to support Chinese OEMs, or as a way of trying to avoid kind of like the pandemic risk that they had by when they were trying to ship products from China to the US? If they're in Mexico, that would have made it easier for them to move products from Mexico to the US. How do you see them, what do you see them as their strategy?
Well, it's very hard to pinpoint the Chinese strategy. Mexico imports a lot of parts, automotive parts from China, which are out of the norm, very inexpensive. They don't qualify with a lot of things. So one objective, of course, is to supply the Mexican and South American markets with those cheap parts. Now, if you look into the future, I think they are laying out the basis for a formal supply chain for assembly. Okay. What other ideas they might have, I don't know, but they are certainly, many of them are already exporters to the US, so they come in because of the basic reasons of nearshoring. They want to cut the cost, they want to cut the risks. So there are a variety of reasons, but they don't talk much. They don't talk much. They just go to their business. Usually in real estate, when we lease a facility, we have a warranty from the headquarters companies. Over here with Chinese, they give no warranties. They say just take us as we are. So they are also changing the real estate market a little bit. But that's to their intentions in the industry right now is to sell as in the short term, and of course in the long term is to sell as many vehicles as they can. Out of those 1.4 million vehicles sold in Mexico, 80% are imports. Okay, only about 20% are made in Mexico. So, and it's mostly in Nissan and those little units. But most of the vehicles sold in Mexico, the big ones, the medium size and the small ones are imported. They are coming here to, because they see a great market opportunity and they want to probably get 50% share of the market in 5 years. And again, their products are very well welcomed by the consumers.
Are the vehicles tend to be smaller vehicles or mid-size and larger vehicles?
Well, it's mostly the small size is the bigger market, and of course there's a very small market for the large ones.
Very good. Justin, one of the questions that we talk about internally, it has to do with the USMCA and the USMCA program that was designed. The new one is designed to really keep track of components that are imported into Mexico in a way that was not really as well tracked in the past. How are they doing that now?
Well, under the NAFTA, you may recall there was the deemed originating list, and so if this predates my time, but if products were not on a particular list, which was crafted in the early 90s, then they were deemed to be originating. They were assumed to be North American.
Yeah.
Regardless of where they may have actually come from. And we saw over time that as technology changed, as the value of components in the vehicles changed, that the shift of North American content in the vehicles was actually shifting. And so what we did in USMCA is remove that option, but also created provisions for core parts and created set it under the agreement, a list of what are really important parts in the vehicle, such as the engine, the transmission, the battery, and required that those have to meet very high regional content numbers in order for the whole vehicle to comply. And then there's some other lists of important parts sort of in descending importance and descending value that are also required to have higher levels of content.
And are these things that happened right when the components come into ports?
So there's a couple of things here. It's as if the components themselves are being traded. So there's going to be a rule that applies to the steering wheel itself, as it crosses the border. But then, you also then have to take into account as the steering wheel is part of the finished vehicle that's crossing the border. So there's a couple of different places where we're looking at those content numbers, where customs is looking at those content numbers.
Yeah. Now, USMCA, it's been in practice for a couple of years now. Are you seeing a positive response from the trade perspective, that you're getting the data that you're expected to get from? I assume that at the beginning it'd be trickier and there's adjustment periods and stuff like that, but we're past the adjustment periods, I think.
To some extent, I mean, some of the provisions are still being phased in.
Are they?
And I think with the pandemic, with the semiconductor shortages, I think we're still seeing some transitions. We are seeing, if you look at the value of products claiming USMCA. So the producer says, I think I meet the threshold, so I'm going to ask for the tariff duty-free benefits.
Right.
The share has actually gone down compared to NAFTA. And that's something we're looking at a bit more carefully, is the reasons why. It could be their own internal supply chains haven't localized or regionalized in North America yet. It could be older vehicles that were built to comply with NAFTA, but the producers, the OEMs, are just not qualifying them under USMCA. There could be a variety of reasons, but and we're looking into that.
Yes, one related thing with the USMCA, Bruce and Justin, that I need to mention is that probably the biggest benefit of the USMCA for Mexico, because in terms of trade, it works pretty much as NAFTA did. I mean, more restrictions and so forth. But the big benefit has been in labor, in union labor. Okay, finally, Mexico with the USMCA broke the control, the domain that very old unions had over many factories. Okay, but now with the USMCA, they are really, the workers have the vote, to elect whatever union they want. This has been a tremendous change and benefit for the workers.
Now, we saw that in particular, it started out, I think, at a GM plant. Was that the Saltillo? Yeah. Have there been other plants that have gone through this process as well? Absolutely, yeah.
And many have elected not even to have a union. So that's also good. I mean, for some, depending on how their structure is in terms of the labor contracts.
Yeah.
But that has been a huge benefit.
Very good. All right, Sergio, that's the only questions we have for you right now. All right. So Justin Hoffman is the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Market Access and Industrial Competitiveness at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, Executive Office of the President. In this role, he's responsible for the formulation and development of U.S. trade policy affecting a number of industrial sectors, including automotive goods, lithium-ion batteries, critical minerals, and chemicals. He leads U.S. efforts at the World Trade Organization and other fora to increase market access for U.S. industrial goods exports by engaging in negotiation with foreign governments. Justin also directs the overall interagency coordination to implement, enforce, and verify the automotive rules of origin under the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, USMCA. Previously, Justin served as a director for industrial goods at USTR and in trade policy positions at the U.S. Department of Commerce and at a Washington, D.C. economic consulting firm. Originally from Western Pennsylvania, he received his MA in International Economic Relations and a BA in International Studies and Economics from American University. Welcome, Justin.
Great. Thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I think Bruce covered most of my personal introduction, but one thing I would add to that is, you know, a lot of my job at USTR is focused on industrial products. As Bruce noted, you know, vehicles, batteries, critical minerals, working to promote export opportunities for U.S. Manufactured goods abroad. And that experience over the past 16, 17 years has really given me a deep understanding of how industries work, how our industry has competitive advantage in certain products, and in other products where we may not have competitive advantages. And so it's provided I think a very helpful, well-rounded introduction to this supply chain work, it even almost at a on the ground level. For those of you that may not be familiar with USTR, we're a very small federal agency, but we have a very large mission. We're part of the Executive Office of the President, and we're charged with leading the President's trade policy agenda, and ultimately supporting American workers, American farmers, ranchers, producers. Throughout this process, we work very closely with other federal agencies to develop and carry out this mission. Our leader is the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai, who's a member of the President's Cabinet, and she's also a member of the President's Council on Supply Chain Resilience. And USTR itself, from the ambassador down, we're participants in a broad range of interagency issues and bodies around supply chain issues, whether it's from critical minerals to semiconductors to advanced batteries. So I'm here today to give you USTR's perspective on building resilience in our automotive supply chains. I don't have any slides to present, but you know, I wanted to give you an overview of our work, just drilling down from sort of the broad U.S. government policies to USTR's work and to USTR's work specifically in the automotive space. So I think it's important to start off with understanding how we got here today and how USTR's work fits into the full U.S. federal government's efforts. You know, as discussed earlier, we've seen how the COVID pandemic, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and other similar disruptions disrupted the global supply chains and global trade. And those stresses put a bright spotlight on pre-existing weaknesses and vulnerabilities in many supply chains, including those in the United States. And we all saw how those disruptions contributed to higher costs throughout the economy. For this audience, I know the shortages of semiconductors was particularly disruptive to the North American industry. I'm sure everyone here has seen the reports that estimated North American auto producers were forced to cut approximately 4.3 million vehicles out of their production schedules from 2021 until the supply chain shortages largely abated in 2023. So in order to respond to these challenges, in 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14017 on securing America's supply chains. And that executive order directed a whole of government review of key sectors and industrial bases. And the goal of that review was to identify particular supply chain vulnerabilities and to recommend a full range of policies and actions to reduce the risks and to prepare to mitigate future disruptions. Once that executive order was issued, an extensive interagency effort under the order led to a comprehensive supply chain assessment that was released in June 2021 that focused on 4 critical sectors: semiconductor manufacturing and advanced packaging, large capacity batteries, which includes EV batteries, critical minerals and materials, including those that are used in EVs, but also may be used in internal combustion vehicles, semiconductors, permanent magnets, for example. And then the last one was on pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs as they're known. Approximately a year later, federal agencies released additional detailed reviews that covered 6 other industrial-based supply chains, focusing on defense, transportation, energy, information and communications technologies, public health, and agriculture and food production. Armed with this information, federal agencies, including USTR, began developing and implementing new policies and promoting investments across these sectors to address the supply chain vulnerabilities that come from geographically concentrated sourcing. And, it's key to remember that this work is also taking place at the same time as federal efforts are underway to spur a transition to a low carbon economy. And for the automotive sector, I think that the government's efforts are probably most evident in the work to guide investments and develop a domestic lithium-ion battery manufacturing chain, as well as the efforts to build a more resilient supply chain for semiconductors. The People's Republic of China, as everyone I think knows, dominates the global production in nearly every stage of the battery supply chain. More than half of the global processing of EV critical minerals happens in the PRC. The U.S. has invested significant while the U.S. has significant reserves of critical minerals needed for EV batteries, we are limited in our capabilities to process and refine those minerals. And often for many critical minerals, they're extracted from the ground in the United States and sent to China for processing before coming back. In the semiconductor space, we've seen potential signs of concerning practices over the last few years from the PRC to expand its firm's legacy chip production and to make it harder for U.S. companies to compete. This over-reliance on the PRC threatens the long-term competitiveness of the U.S. automotive industry and the U.S. economy as a whole. And for these reasons, it's why the government has issued various blueprints or roadmaps, such as the National Blueprint for Lithium-Ion Batteries, which seeks to support and stimulate the domestic production of key inputs in the EV supply chain. And the government is also undertaking similar efforts through the CHIPS and Science Act to bolster the competitiveness of mature node semiconductor production. I know Bruce had touched upon earlier some of the key pieces of legislation. While the executive order and the government's policy reviews have provided a roadmap and set the goals of where we would like to go, the key pieces of legislation really provided the spark or the fuel to get to those goals. 2021's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the aforementioned CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, and then 2022's Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, are 3 key pieces of legislation that are fueling the conversion of the supply chain resiliency plans into reality. Under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, for example, the United States is investing more than $7 billion to develop and diversify supply chains for batteries, helping to ensure that the EV revolution is powered by U.S. critical minerals and battery materials. And if you haven't already, I would definitely encourage you to check out the Department of Energy's website, which has information on the really exciting projects that will be supported by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funding. The CHIPS and Science Act provided the Commerce Department with over $52 billion over 5 years to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing, including $39 billion of which is incentives to encourage investment in facilities and equipment in the United States and to support research in the United States and investing in American workers. And then the IRA, as we all know, is probably the single largest investment in climate and energy in American history. The IRA's clean vehicle tax credits are well known in that they're designed to promote the purchase of and use of clean vehicles by lower or middle income Americans, to promote resilient supply chains, and to achieve significant carbon emission reductions. But the IRA also contains billions of dollars of loans, grants, and other tax incentives to accelerate development and manufacturing of EVs and the upstream batteries and battery components in the United States. So turning to trade and how we take sort of the broader picture of supply chain resilience and look at it through a trade lens. Reducing these dependencies and vulnerabilities and strengthening the supply chains is a major priority of the United States and of the United States and of USTR. And it informs USTR's work as part of the President's Council on Supply Chain Resilience. I think earlier Bruce had mentioned the globalization golden rule. And I think it's important to note from the administration's perspective, supply chain resilience means more than just ensuring the goods get from point A to point B, but it's also about enhancing the quality of the trade. Resilient supply chains reduce opportunities for economic coercion and enhance our economic security. Resilient supply chains provide a range of sourcing options. They allow us to adapt, to rebound, recover with agility following shocks. Resilient supply chains uphold labor rights and environmental protections. And they also strengthen U.S. manufacturing and base in the U.S. manufacturing workforce. In this area, USTR is actively engaged in coordinating with like-minded trading partners to develop durable solutions that advance supply chain resiliency in several critical areas, such as addressing food insecurity in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, tackling forced labor in global supply chains. I think earlier the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act was mentioned. That's a key example of tackling forced labor. Facilitating trade in safe and effective medicines and to minimize drug shortages. We're also engaged in securing smoother and more efficient movement of essential goods during a possible future pandemic. And we've worked to protect the uninterrupted flow of trade in North America during an during an emergency such as a future pandemic. USTR and our interagency colleagues have been focused on discussing these issues in various international fora, including the G7, the G20, with our Asia Pacific partners through APEC and through the OECD. Supply chains has also been a focus of the European Union Trade and Technology Council. But I do want to comment, I know Bruce had mentioned earlier that he thought most of our trade agreements don't address supply chain resiliency. And I'm not sure if I fully agree with that comment. It's true, most of our free trade agreements don't contain specific supply chain provisions. The agreements do contain provisions that require regular contact with our trading partners. These are often at technical levels, such as committees that focus on particular chapters of the trade agreement, such as national treatment and market access, or customs issues or rules of origin issues. And ultimately, there's regular contact at higher levels, often the trade minister level. And then beyond our free trade agreements, we also have what are called trade investment framework agreements, or TIFAs, with a much broader group of countries. And the TIFAs have similar consultation mechanisms or mechanisms for regular dialogue with the partners. And it's been through these TIFA dialogues that we've also been discussing supply chain issues, such as critical minerals and critical mineral supply chain. But I will note in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that the United States did negotiate the first of its kind agreement on supply chains, which establishes a framework among the Indo-Pacific nations for deeper collaboration to prevent, mitigate, and prepare for future supply chain disruptions. In the Western Hemisphere, I know a lot of our work in the trade track under the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity will also focus on supply chain resilience. Bilaterally, we've negotiated a critical minerals agreement with Japan to help strengthen and diversify electric vehicle battery supply chains. And we initiated similar negotiations with the European Union and the United Kingdom. But to continue our work to develop innovative trade tools and strategies for connecting trade and other economic policy measures to advance supply chain resilience, USTR published a Federal Register notice last month. In that notice, we identified autos and auto parts among various key sectors where we sought input on how trade and investment policy tools could be deployed to enhance supply chain resilience. And the input received through this Federal Register process will help us at USTR to draw upon various perspectives from all corners of the economy and experiences from those stakeholders to get a more granular understanding of the supply chain challenges and to identify potential policy solutions. And although the window to provide written comments as part of that Federal Register notice closed earlier this week, there's still an opportunity that closes today to testify at one of several hearings the USTR will hold in the month of May, including one fully virtual hearing. And so it's through these efforts that we're working to integrate our trade tools with domestic economic measures in order to position U.S. manufacturing and services for continued leadership and competitiveness. And we're also collaborating with our trading partners and allies to incentivize a race to the top through stronger coordination and alignment on labor and environmental protections with trusted networks and to address unfair trade practices. So focusing the lens down even at a more detailed level is the USMCA. And as you know, the automotive sector today is among the largest in North America in terms of production and employment. Autos and auto parts are among the top traded items within North America. And so the USMCA is really our primary tool in the automotive space to address supply chain challenges. Through the USMCA, we worked closely with our partners in Canada and Mexico to strengthen the rules of origin around automotive goods, to incentivize increased investment in auto and auto parts production in North America, and to further integrate the North American automotive industry. The rules of origin under USMCA determine how much production and often what types of production must take place within North America in order for the entire vehicle or even the parts of the vehicle to receive duty-free treatment when traded between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Touched upon a bit of this earlier. The USMCA raised the regional value content requirements, and that's the overall value of the vehicle that must come from North America was raised to 75% under USMCA, and that's up from 62.5% under the NAFTA. The USMCA also included requirements, as I mentioned earlier, on certain core parts, which they themselves must meet certain high regional value content provisions in order for the entire vehicle to qualify. There's also a steel and aluminum purchase requirement on the USMCA, which requires the OEMs to source at least 70% of their steel and aluminum from within North America. And in a few years, those the requirements around steel are going to get a little bit tighter in that the steel must be melted and poured within North America. So in addition to those requirements, there's also a new labor value content rule, which requires that a certain percentage of a vehicle must be produced by employees making an average of at least $16 per hour. So as you put all these together, and if you meet all of these requirements, then the vehicle itself can qualify for duty-free treatment under the USMCA. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the large-scale investments we're seeing in EV battery supply chain in North America. But from USTR's perspective, we're also seeing new investments across other parts of the supply chain, from engines to stampings to EV drive motors, that are all thanks in part to the USMCA's new rules of origin. And highlighting some of these benefits of the new rules, last summer, the U.S. International Trade Commission published a report where it analyzed the economic impact of those rules on the U.S. economy. And although the new rules had not been fully implemented yet, the industry was still struggling to overcome the disruptions due to the pandemic and the semiconductor shortage. The Commission still found a positive impact on the new USMCA rules of origin. The U.S. International Trade Commission's model indicated that during the first 2 years of the USMCA, the U.S. automotive industry experienced reduced imports of engines and transmissions from outside of America, and it saw an increase in employment, revenue, capital expenditures, and profits as a result of these new rules of origin. And the model also estimated that nearly 4,000 vehicle and parts production jobs were added to the United States, and the U.S. wages, total U.S. wages, increased by 2.7 million in vehicle production and by 239 million in parts production as a result of these rules of origin. Another example of how USTR's work to advance supply chain resilience in the USMCA is the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism. The Rapid Response Labor Mechanism enables us to reverse a race to the bottom and help us to empower workers to shift away from a focus on cost minimalization that contributes to supply chain concentration. The Rapid Response Mechanism allows USTR to bring cases against specific facilities that fail to respect the rights of workers to freedom of association and collective bargaining. USTR has been using this mechanism diligently. Since 2021, the United States has sought Mexico's review under the Rapid Response Mechanism across a wide range of industries, from automotive, but also including the garments industry, mining, and services industries. Now, I mentioned earlier, I think one of the main criticisms of the NAFTA was that its automotive rules of origin remained static and became increasingly obsolete as vehicle technology and manufacturing processes advanced. And this meant, unfortunately, that newer, more valuable vehicle content, regardless of the source, received preferential tariff treatment that was originally intended only to support North American manufacturers and workers. And so not only did the USMCA close its technological gaps, but the USMCA also includes several mechanisms for the United States, Mexico, and Canada to come together and assess the agreement, to uphold the rule, to update the rules as necessary, and to ensure that the agreement and the rules remain effective in deepening North American integration. Further, the United States Congress directed USTR to undertake regular reviews on the operation of the USMCA with respect to automotive goods. And we're actually in the process of one of those biennial reviews. Earlier this year, we saw input from OEMs, parts producers, organized labor, and other interested parties on the USMCA rules of origin. Through that public process, we received suggestions from stakeholders on how to better align USMCA's rules of origin with the large-scale EV battery investments underway in North America. We received suggestions on modifications to the core parts list to better account for electric and new energy vehicles. We also received suggestions on how the rules can better incentivize North American production for other clean energy vehicles, such as heavy trucks powered by hydrogen. The final results of our review will be issued in a report to Congress, and it will be published on USTR's website by no later than July 1st. And under direction of Congress, we're undertaking subsequent reviews every 2 years through 2030. So in closing, I would like to echo comments that Ambassador Tai recently delivered on the issue of supply chain resiliency. And she had noted that trade can help build resilience in our supply chains and create incentives to ensure resilience for our economies. It can prepare all of us to withstand and cushion future shocks, and it can ensure that we all have more options. And I will add to that, that working to ensure supply chains are resilient, secure, and sustainable presents some of the biggest policy challenges of our day. And it's clear that we must work together. We must work closely with allies and partners such as Canada and Mexico to overcome these challenges. And public input from all corners of the economy is critically important to that process. And so therefore, I urge you all to remain engaged, to participate in our request for public comments, to provide us your views through fora such as this. It's greatly appreciated. And with that, I really appreciate you having me all here today and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Justin. Very good, detailed information about trade issues related to a variety of areas. Let me bring our other folks in. Now, one of the things that you were talking about was the issue of, and we really see it. We've been tracking, as you guys have, the investments that have been going on in the U.S. for batteries and minerals and materials that are part of batteries, and as well as the facilities that are being built, and the support that the government is giving through the IRA, manufacturing credits, things like that, as well as the supply, as well as the consumer side with the incentives. One of the things that we struggle with when we start looking at the materials, particularly for batteries, is some of the materials are in countries where we do not have free trade agreements. In particular, I think it's nickel in Indonesia, and of course, there's some battery materials in I think it's cobalt in Africa, again, where we don't have free trade agreements. But both of these are critical elements for development of electric vehicle batteries. How do you see the U.S. managing this kind of, from a trade perspective, of course, how do you see this U.S. managing this in the longer term? We know that this is, the IRA stretches out till 2032, so we don't really expect it to happen, yesterday. But how do you see that playing out?
Sure. And apologies, because I'm going to get, I think, super technical here. But so I think, the negotiators, when they negotiated the USMCA, especially for batteries, they were well aware of this, and they took that into account. So EV batteries are considered a core part under the USMCA, and therefore a large share has to come from North America. And what that means for the other core parts like the engines, the transmissions, is pretty much 75% of the content must come from North America. But there's an exception when it comes to the batteries. And taking into account that a large share of a battery's value is probably in the critical minerals, which are probably not North American. The battery has what's called a tariff shift. And this essentially means if you can demonstrate that you move from one tariff code, so lumber, to a separate tariff code, such as a finished table, that could meet the rule of origin. And for batteries, the way the rule is set is that as long as a cell is made in North America, then the battery itself should qualify, as it's rolled up into a module or a pack. And so that's how at the moment we take that into account. So if you're building cells in North America, we're not really focused on where the inputs to those cells come from under USMCA. But I think as I noted, all the investments under the infrastructure law, under the IRA, we're going to have more and more North American inputs into the battery supply chain that we may in the future want to revisit that rule to better capture that and better incentivize that to lock in those investments.
Mhm. When you look at the processing story, how do you see that playing out? Because we talked about this. I think Amy was brought this up where the processing, I think the numbers are like 90% of the battery materials being processed in China. How do we get around that?
Well, through, a lot of investments, as I mentioned, through the infrastructure law, tax credits through the IRA. But I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing, especially in the short run, is the decline in prices for those critical minerals. As EV uptake globally in China here has slowed, demand for those critical minerals has slowed, the prices have declined. And there's been some high-profile stories of U.S. mines that were supposed to come online very soon of maybe just holding off because it's the mineral's not at a price that supports that mine.
And it's so tricky because if the prices are low, that should be good for the price of the vehicle because the batteries are cheaper, therefore the whole vehicle becomes cheaper. So from a consumer perspective, you go say, well, prices are low, that's a good thing. But from a business perspective, for the companies that are mining, it doesn't work for them. Is there a sweet spot there for that meets the needs of consumers for lower price EVs and the miners for actually investing?
I'll caveat that this gets beyond USTR's purview quite a bit, but we are working with the interagency on how different agencies can use their different authorities to address that issue. And I think I think you're seeing it. You have the investments on the infrastructure law on the supply side, but then you have the tax credits under the IRA on the demand side to help that process.
Mm-hmm. Sergio, do you see any attempts in Mexico to consider or to work on processing of those minerals or materials in Mexico?
Well, yes, they talk a lot about it, but I think most of the activity is happening in the US.
Mm-hmm.
In Mexico, I mean that those types of investments are very high end. So they talk about it, the authorities do, they have the intent, but I don't see any real thing on the ground yet.
Yeah. Amy, do you have any perspective on that topic?
I don't have perspective necessarily on the status or integration of processing here. What I will say is, as we just touched on, most of these materials are coming from Africa and other underdeveloped nations. Most of the processing is then in turn being done in China. So from a national security standpoint, above and beyond even automotive, there needs to be a hard look at the processing activity itself. There's been a lot of conversation centered around local governments, wishing to retain some or bring in-house some of the processing capabilities. So some African nations, this is being looked at. But processing requires a unique expertise and set of skills that at this point are not inherent in other populations, such as certain countries in Africa. Additionally, there is a copious amount of energy required to process these materials. And so for any energy-strapped nation, again, referring especially to those in the interior of Africa, there is not huge opportunity to bring processing on in a real conversation anytime soon. But yet, I think it's critical that the conversation start. And some type of, partnership mentality or approach might be beneficial, subsidies, other incentives to work with the owners of those types of minerals to build up the critical infrastructure to eventually support processing, be it here or there. Because if, in the void of the US taking a more active role, China is already pursuing a lot of the infrastructural buildup in the central of Africa as well to support, furtherance of the supply chain. Of course, also supporting their continued dominance in that space. And again, because we rely so heavily, not just in automotive, but in critical medical device manufacture and defense systems, this is an area where, it goes above the EV market and really holistically needs to be approached with some urgency, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very good points. I've got a trade issue here for you, Justin. Do you see companies using strategies like moving goods through US friendly countries to hide their origin?
We would probably, our customs colleagues would consider that to be circumvention, and possibly violate, our customs laws.
Mhm.
There's rules about that. There's rules about, of course, supply chains may stretch through several countries, but they would dictate how much production you need to in a third country. And I think CBP would look closely at that and want to verify, are you actually, you're turning that lumber into a table there, or are you just transshipping the table through to avoid tariffs, to avoid other potential, actions?
Right. Yeah, one of our researchers in the past, at the height of globalization, even within North America, talked about a thing called parts tourism, where a part would start in the U.S. It would go to Mexico. It might go to Mexico for some kind of processing. It would get sent to Canada for some more processing, and then come back to either the U.S. or Mexico to be inserted into a vehicle. Keeping track of that must be impossible. Is that still going on?
It is, and one of the things we've heard as part of our review this year is from the part suppliers from MEMA. Talking about how that's actually on the part suppliers. It's difficult for them. It's difficult for the OEMs as well to track that, because they need to understand how much North American content is in it, how much North American content's being added each time it bounces back and forth. And so there's a bit of an administrative burden there in tracking that.
Sergio or Amy, do you have any questions for Justin?
Well, not really. I just have a comment that in this subject of nearshoring and reshoring, actually the US is the biggest competitor of Mexico because of the very low cost of electricity, in spite of higher labor costs. I mean, there are many things in real estate and utilities that make the US quite competitive in cost-wise versus Mexico.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you, Justin. The EU is researching whether China has subsidized its auto manufacturers and suppliers to such an extent that it creates unfair pricing of vehicles sold alongside EU manufacturers. How are governments able to find out information such as this about other countries?
So, I mean, from a variety of sources, in a variety of ways. I'm not familiar with the EU's anti-subsidy laws or the powers. I think in the United States, under our own anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, we would call the anti-subsidy law our countervailing duty law in the United States. I believe, and I would defer to my Commerce Department colleagues for a definitive answer, but I believe that gives the Commerce Department the power to subpoena or compel companies to provide detailed data as they conduct their analysis.
Okay. Here's a question from our audience about, there's a possibility under a different administration that the IRA could be repealed. It goes on till 2032. So there's a lot of money that is still going to be spent over that long period of time. Well, what would it mean if it was repealed for EV, OEM resilience, in critical minerals and battery manufacturing supply chains?
I'm hesitant to speculate from my perch here as a civil servant on what that could mean. We would obviously continue to implement the law and implement the president's trade policies, regardless of a change in administration.
Yeah, I know it's tricky. Hypotheticals, right? It's like I never answer. I know I answer hypotheticals. One attendee asked about the mine in the U.S. that was uncertain about coming online. I think that was a cobalt mine, wasn't it?
I believe a cobalt mine up in Idaho or Montana. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Let's see. Well, I guess when you look at the discussion that we've been having, and Amy, you can jump in on this, and Sergio, when you look at the future of the automotive industry from a supply chain resilience perspective, and when you look at, I asked the same question for Eric Jeremy because he was leaving, but I wanted to get your guys' thinking about this as well. When you look 5 to 10 years out, and I think Amy may already even answered this one. When you look 5 to 10 years out, how do you see the maybe the distribution of nearshoring, reshoring, as well as friendshoring, and keeping things pretty much as they are? How do you see that changing over that period of time? What the supply chain might look like? Let's start with you, Justin.
Sure. I think, obviously the goal of the USMCA is to, friendshore, and to further integrate the North American automotive industry. And so I think we would hope to see more of that happening, which would then make the industry, competitive against the other sort of regional centers in the global automotive industry. But I think the China question is probably the wild card there. Sergio had touched upon a lot of that during his presentation, and it's something that we're going to monitor closely, because from our perspective, a lot of that industry has been supported by various non-market policies and practices, and has, in my words, supercharged the Chinese automotive industry. And those types of policies and practices are not done in the United States, or not done in Mexico, perhaps. And so how do we compete with that? How do our companies compete in what very well could be a very unlevel playing field? And so I think that's something that we're going to be closely monitoring, over the next few years.
Sergio, how do you see the things changing over the next 5-10 years?
Well, with the China wild card, like in politics, my answer is, well, let's see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. Amy?
I think I probably just covered this enough the last time I spoke on it. You know, I think there is definitely a wild card with China. I think there's a lot of other things at play, you know, the emergence of a burgeoning middle class, you know, the inability or just undesire of the youth to perhaps work in some of the traditional factory and other type settings that exist in China today. So I think it'll be an interesting ride. But I do think there will be at least some semblance of reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring that will start to really maybe accelerate over the next couple of years here.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of incentive for that to happen.
And there's a lot of downside for companies that, you know, err on the side of complete, you know, presence in China without diversification as well. A lot of risk.
Well, at the same time, building for localization. I mean, this is where the OEMs that have built factories in the foreign OEMs who have built factories in China were almost exclusively just for China. So it really wasn't. I mean, there are not a ton of vehicles that come from China yet. Well, at least not to the U.S. More coming to the EU, and then more coming to Mexico and the rest of the world. But in the past, that was not the case. It was very much very localized. But things have changed, and I'm sure we'll come back to this question, you know, in a couple of years to say, okay, what's happened since then? You know, what's happened since we last talked? And with that, I'm going to end it for today. I want to thank Justin and Amy and Sergio, as well as Jeremy, for a great discussion on this topic, because it's not an easy one, and things we're still in the early stages of this, of what may or may not happen, but you know, there's a lot of government support for the changes in this. That are playing out, and I think it'll be as Sergio said, we will see. We will see. Thanks again, all of you. Well, to end this conference, I want to again thank our affiliates. We couldn't put on these conferences without them. It's an important thing for us. We feel it's important to talk to the industry, to hear from the industry, and our conferences are one way of doing that. Our next conference, as I mentioned earlier, will be July 17th, our 16th annual Future of our Propulsion Strategies for the 21st Century conference, looking at the future of charging. Again, we encourage everybody online and here who hasn't done it yet to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us. As we said earlier, presentations will be up and the video will be up this weekend. So if you have any questions about anything about that, feel free to reach out to me. And I think we're going to call it a day and say thank you to everybody in the room and everybody online, and we'll see you next time. Take care.